CHAPTER XXVI of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horne Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 26. Miss Austen remained but a few moments in the studio. She was embarrassed and angry, and Rush was not the sole object of her wrath. She anathematized herself not only for permitting her literary enthusiasm to carry her to the point of attempting coercion, and running the risk of being called bad names by an expert in crime, but for speaking out impulsively in the first place, and throwing her cards on the table. It had been her intention to cultivate the wretch's acquaintance, and lead him on with excessive subtlety, but he had proved impervious to her maidenly hints that she would like to know him better; equally so to her boyish invitation to come over some evening and meet a number of the newspaper girls who were all fighting for his client. 15 minutes alone with him in the quiet streets of Elsinore at night was an opportunity that might never come again, and she had surrendered to impulse. She was now more deeply convinced than ever that he had killed David Balfame, but although she had no intention of denouncing him even if she found her proofs in the course of persistent sleuthing, she thought it wise to keep him guessing, as the uneasiness of mind caused by this constant pressure from without might eventually drive him to her for counsel and aid. Like all healthy young American writers of fiction, she was an incurable optimist, and as yet untempered in the least by the practical experiences of a New York reporter. After a few moments' desultory conversation she announced that she must run, and as Alys opened the door Miss Austen turned to the lawyer, who had risen and stood by the stove. "Good night, Mr. Rush," she said sweetly. "So glad you are defending poor Mrs. Balfame, but you know I never did believe she did it, and I have good reason to hope that we shall all know the truth in about a fortnight." Rush bowed politely, as she did not offer her hand. "You would save me much trouble and Mrs. Balfame much expense. I wish you all good luck." Her brows met and her dark grey eyes turned black, but she swung on her heel and marched out with her head in the air. Rush remained behind, as it was evident the two girls wanted a last mysterious word together. Alys returned in a few moments, and with a swift step. Her face was radiant. She too held her head high, but as if she lifted her face to drink in some magic elixir of the night. This was the first time she had seen Rush since he had immersed himself in the case, and now he had come to her unasked, and as naturally as in the old days, when weary with work and the sordid revelations of the courts. Her mercurial spirits, which had hung low in the scale for weeks, had gone up with a rush that filled her and her reckless unreasoning happiness. Perhaps intimacy with Mrs. Balfame had disillusioned him in little ways. Perhaps he had discovered the truth for himself and despised her for a cold-blooded liar where he might have forgiven her honest admission of the actual crime. It would be just like his exaggerated idealism. There never was any love that could not be killed by transgression of some pet prejudice, some violation of secret fastidiousness. At all events he was here, and with every appearance of spending a long evening. What did the rest matter? He was still standing as she entered, staring at a water colour of a bit of the woods west of Elsinore. The trees were stately and old, the shadows green and shot with the gold of some stray beam of the sun dancing down through that heavy canopy with puckish triumph. A rocky brook crossed the glade, and behind was a subtle suggestion of the uninterrupted forest, deserted and absolutely still. Rush had recognized the spot. "My village, Rennselaerville, is on the other side," he said, turning a boyish face to Alys. "I have been 14 again in a few moments. Last summer I only got a day off now and again to loaf in those woods. I wish I had been with you when you painted this." She unhooked the picture and handed it to him. "Please let me give it to you. I'd like so much if you would hang it in one of your rooms, say behind your desk, so that when you are tired or puzzled you can wheel about and lose yourself for a moment. I am sure it wouldn't be a bad substitute for the real thing." She spoke with a shy eagerness and an entire absence of coquetry. He put out both hands for the picture. "I should think it wouldn't. It is just like you to think of it. Indeed, I will accept it." And he remembered how many cases he had forgotten under her kindly tact, both in this cool green studio and that other room of woodland shades in the cottage. He was wondering if he had not been a conceited ass and misconstrued an increasing warmth of friendship in this fine impulsive creature, when he remembered Miss Austen's insinuations and sat down abruptly, recalled to the object of his visit. Alys had invited him to smoke, but had not produced her box of Russian cigarettes. Miss Austen, who was determined to keep her nerves in order and her efficiency at high water mark, did not smoke, and Rush had his prejudices. While he puffed away at his cigar and stretched his long legs out to the fire, she leaned back against a mass of pillows on the divan and congratulated herself that she had put on a charming primrose yellow gown in honour of her Aunt Dissosway and two other guests entertained by her mother at supper. It was rhythmical in its harmony with the olives of the room and of her own rare colouring. Rush, who had been studying his picture, looked up and smiled at the other picture on the divan. In the soft lamplight Alys's smooth dark hair looked as olive as her eyes, and there was a faint stain of pink on the ivory of her cheeks. Beneath the lace that covered her slender bust was a delicate note of ribbons and fine lawn, and the little feet in pointed bronze slippers showed through transparent stockings. More by instinct than calculated effect, Alys on such occasions managed to create an aura of fastidiousness and dainty femininity while stopping short of invitation. Rush scowled as his mind leaped to the substantial and sensibly clad feet of his beautiful client, and to a pile of stout, unribboned underwear that had been brought into the jail sitting room one day when he awaited her tardy appearance. For the first time he wondered if such things really counted in human happiness. Not so much, perhaps, for the artistic delight in them that a plain man like himself might be able to feel as for all that they stood, the elusive but auspicious signal. He shook himself angrily and sat up. "Your young friend thinks I murdered Balfame," he announced. Alys started under this frontal attack, but smiled ironically. "I knew she had conceived some such nonsensical theory, mainly because she wanted to have it so. Sarah intends to be a novelist. So she did me the honour to confide. She even promised me all the immunity that lay within her jurisdiction if I would reward her with a full confession. Really, she is too absurd. Don't let it worry you. You have nothing to fear." "I'm not so sure." Alys sat up as rigidly as if armoured like Mrs. Battle. "What do you mean?" she breathed. "Miss Austen has arrived at the conclusion that I am in love with Mrs. Balfame. She is an outsider with no data whatever to work on. It is reasonable to suppose that sooner or later our good fellow citizens will work round to the same theory." "That is just the one theory they never will conceive or accept. They know better. That sort of thing never was in Mrs. Balfame's line. The women know that if she doesn't exactly hate men, she has a quiet but profound contempt for them. I wish you could have seen them, her particular crowd, at Mrs. Battle's the day of the arrest. Just to draw them out, I suggested that some man who was in love with her might have fired the shot. They nearly annihilated me. Mrs. Balfame, guilty of the crime of murder or not, is fairly screwed on her pedestal so far as the women are concerned. As for the men, such a theory will never occur to them, for the simple reason that not one has ever been attracted by her. She's the very last woman they would expect any man to commit murder for." Rush, wondering if these observations were dictated by venom or a mere regard for facts, shot a veiled glance at the divan. Miss Crumley's soft, carefully de-Americanized voice had not sharpened, but her face was very mobile for all its reserve. She was looking most aggressively impersonal, and had sunk back against the high pillows in a limp, indolent line. Facts, of course. "It is very like a political campaign," said he. "Nobody is quite sane in this town just now, and the wildest conclusions are bound to be jumped at. It is not only embryo novelists that have romantic imaginations. Just reflect that I am Mrs. Balfame's counsel, that I am still a young man and unmarried, and that she is a beautiful woman and looks many years younger than her age. There you are." Alice made an abrupt change of position, which in one less graceful would have suggested a wriggle. However, her voice remained impersonal. "But this community, including her friends, believe that she did it. They want her to get off, but they have settled the question in their own minds and are not looking around for anyone else. Cummack and several of the other men are, besides Balfame's old political pals, and his enemies for that matter. Old Dutch, who is far shrewder than his son, is by no means certain of Mrs. Balfame's guilt, and has put a detective on the job, against her acquittal, having no desire to see suspicion pointing at his house again. He is just the old sentimentalist to settle on me." He saw the pink fade out of her cheeks, leaving her face like cold ivory, but she answered steadily: "You have an alibi. You went to Brooklyn that evening to keep an appointment." "I don't mind telling you that although I went to Brooklyn that night I did not see the man I was after. I went on the spur of the moment, more because I wanted to get out of Elsinore than anything else. I didn't have time to telephone before catching the train, but when I left it in Brooklyn I telephoned and found that he had gone to New York. I gave no name. It was a matter of no importance. Then, as there was no one else I cared to talk to, I took the next train back, and as my head ached and I felt as nervous as a cat, from overwork and other things, tramped for hours until I met Dr. Anna out by the marsh, and she drove me in." "Dr. Anna?" "Yes, and I have reason to believe she thinks I shot Balfame, but she would never denounce anyone if she could help it." "Oh, you are all wrong. She believes, like everybody else, that Mrs. Balfame did it. My Aunt Dissosway is superintendent out there, and has been listening to her delirious mutterings. She's never mentioned you. I drove out there for the second time on Sunday. I haven't told mother, as she is one of the few that believe Mrs. Balfame innocent. But when Dr. Anna is coherent at all, that is the impression my aunt gets. But oh, of course, she's only guessing, like everybody else. She couldn't know. She was out at the Houston farm." Rush was sitting up very straight. "Has anyone been permitted to see her?" "Of course not." "Not that it would matter. Delirious people all have insane fancies. But I don't believe she had any such idea before she came down. And besides, it is not true. Mrs. Balfame is innocent." "Of course, as her lawyer, you must persuade yourself that she is." "If I had not believed in her I would not have taken the case, great as my desire would be to help her. I am no good at pleading against my convictions. I'd fail with the jury. If I had believed her guilty I should have got her the best counsel possible and helped him all I could." Alice had a curious sense of physical paralysis, or of spiritual dissociation from her body. She made no attempt to decide which, but that the cause was an intense nervous excitement she was well aware. As she stared at him with dilated eyes, he was suddenly convinced that Miss Austin was right in assuming that Alice had some secret and important knowledge bearing upon the crime. Was her reticence due to the common Elsinore loyalty? If so, why her reserve with him, who would have parted with his life rather than with any facts that still further would incriminate Mrs. Balfame? Then in a flash he understood, for his keen faculties were on edge, concentrated to one point and as sensitive as magnets. He recalled his high estimate of this girl during the weeks of their intimacy, and the instinctive doubts that had assailed him in his rooms on the night of the murder. And as he realized the fierce battle that was raging in that passionate but disciplined soul, he knew that she loved him, and he scorned himself for attributing her former tentative advances to calculation, or that compound of nerves and imagination which so many women call love. She had given him her heart, and it had betrayed her. But while the knowledge gave him an unexpected thrill, he ruthlessly determined to try and to test her to the utmost. He stood up and walked about the room for a moment, and then halted directly in front of her. "Do you know anything?" he asked abruptly. "About what? Do you think I suspect you?" "No, I don't. I mean Mrs. Balfame." "I told you we all believe she did it. We can't help ourselves." "I don't understand the attitude of any of you women who were her friends, her intimates. They rather, have let her lead this community for years, believed her to be little short of perfection, and now with one accord they accept her guilt as a matter of course." "I think they came to with a sort of shock and realized they never had understood her at all. She had them all hypnotized. I think she's one of those Occidentals with terrible latent powers for whom new laws will have to be made when they awake to consciousness of them and begin to develop them with the power and skill of the Orientals. Beg pardon, but let's keep to the present." "Well, I mean it rather excites them to be able to believe, not so much that she did it, as that she was capable of it, that while uniformly sweet and serene, she had those terrible secreted depths. She reminds one of Lucretia Borgia or Catherine de Medici." "Why poisonous? You don't mean to say they take any stock in that story of the poisoned lemonade?" And before Alys could collect her startled faculties she had stammered: "Oh, of course not. They laugh at that. Balfame was shot. What's the use of The water in the vial no doubt was put there to rinse it, and Dr. Anna absently put it back in place. I merely mentioned the names of the first wicked women that occurred to me. Somehow Mrs. Balfame suggests that historic tribe to our friends. No doubt this crime in their midst has irritated what little imagination they have." Her chest was rising under quick heart beats, stirring the soft nest of ribbon and lawn under the lace of her gown, a part of the picture that he did not appreciate until later. At the moment he was observing her dilated eyes, the strained muscles of her nostrils and mouth. He found himself interested in feminine psychology for the first time in his life, and as he hated a liar above all transgressors, he wondered why he inconsistently delighted in not being able to comprehend this complex little creature, and at the same time hoped, his own breathing almost as irregular as hers, that she would continue to lie. But he pushed on. He had a dim sense that far more tremendous issues were at stake than further proof of his client's guilt, and deep in his soul was an ache to feel reassured that staggering old ideals might yet be reinforced with vitality. "Have you told Jim Broderick that Dr. Anna accuses Mrs. Balfame?" "Of course not. He would be climbing the porch the first dark night." "Have you been tempted to tell him?" She shrank farther back and looked up at him under lowered lips. "Tempted? What? Why should I?" "Well, I haven't told him or anyone. That is all that matters." "Exactly. I only meant, of course, that I have a reprehensible masculine disbelief in the ability of a woman to keep a secret. I might have known you would be the exception, as you are to so many rules. And I mean that. But Broderick is an old friend of yours and preternaturally keen on the case." "Oh. You haven't told me why you in particular believe so firmly in my client's guilt. You are the last person to be influenced by either the ravings of a typhoid patient hallucinations generally or any of the sentimental and romantic theories of these half-baked women that spend their leisure taking on flesh, playing bridge, and running over to New York. If you believe Mrs. Balfame is guilty, you must have some fairly good reason, perhaps proof." She could not guess that he was trying her. She imagined his insistence due to apprehension, a desire to know the worst. The hour she had dreaded and desired had come, and she had almost let its opportunities escape. These last weeks in New York, filled with work and novel distraction, had repoised her, unconsciously. She had begun to doubt, some time since, if she would be able to violate her old standards when the test came, but not for a moment had she ceased with all the concentrated forces of her being to long for his desertion of Mrs. Balfame, and if she had rejoiced sometimes that she was incapable of a demoralizing act, she had at others been equally disgusted with her failure in inexorable purpose. She told herself that the big brains were ruthless, able to hold down and out of sight one side of the character they governed, while giving the hidden forces for evil full play, never in wantonness, of course, but in sternly calculated necessity. She had a suspicion that this was just the form of greatness Mrs. Balfame possessed, and it increased her disesteem of self and inspired her with a second form of jealousy. The bitter tides were welling to the surface once more. She asked abruptly: "Is Sarah Austin's theory true? Are you in love with Mrs. Balfame?" "What has that to do with it?" "It has its bearings." "I don't think I should be expected to answer that question. I can say this, however, that as long as she is my client and in jail, I shall have no time to think of personal matters, of love above all. My job is to get her off, and it occupies about 16 hours out of the 24. I oughtn't to be here, but relief, distraction, is imperative now and again." "It would be too delightful if you would come here when you wanted both." Her tones were polite without being eager, but she found it impossible to smile. "Yes, I will. But I shall ignore the subject we are discussing. Rest doesn't lie precisely that way. For that reason we'll finish up now. Why do you believe Mrs. Balfame guilty?" "If I could prove to you that she was, would you throw over the case?" He hesitated and regarded her fixedly for a moment through narrowed lids. "Yes," he said finally. "I would get one of the men whose firm I expect to join the first of the year to take the case." She sat erect once more and twisted her hands together, but tried to smile impersonally as she returned his gaze. "Would you then have time to love her?" Again he hesitated. Although he was beginning to hate himself, he felt as if he had some beautiful wild thing of his woods in a trap, but an imperious inner necessity urged him on. "Probably not. Now, will you tell me? Now?" She slipped to the floor and confronted him, holding her small head very high. No doubt the upward movement was unconscious in its expression, but he thought her very lovely and proud as she stood there, and for the first time he took note of the subtlety in that delicate, mobile face. "I really know nothing," she said lightly. "It is just this: if you or any other innocent person were in danger, I should feel called upon to unravel certain clues. Naturally I should make no move otherwise. Mrs. Balfame is an old friend of ours, and then well, our local pride may be absurd, but there it is. We must watch Jim Broderick. He has discovered the intimacy between Dr. Anna and Mrs. Balfame, and also what all know here that they were alone together during those last morning hours before the murder. I'll warn my aunt. He really couldn't get at her not now, at all events. What he is after, of course, is not so much corroboration, but a new and sensational story to keep the case going. And of course, as it was the press that ran Mrs. Balfame to earth, a statement from a woman of Dr. Anna's standing justifying it would be an immense triumph." She had moved over to a table against the farther wall, and she struck a match and applied it to the wick of an alcohol lamp. "I am going to make you a cup of tea. It will rest without overstimulating you, and you must go right from here to bed. I'm sorry mother doesn't keep whiskey in the house. I don't drink when I'm on a case. That's one advantage I generally have over the other side. It will be delightful to drink tea with you once more, although I'm free to say that outside of this house I never drank a cup of tea in my life." The atmosphere was as agreeably light as if ponderable clouds had suddenly rolled out of the room. Two young people drew up to a smaller table and drank several cups of tea that had stood 3 minutes, nibbled excellent biscuit, and talked about the war. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 27. 3 days before the date set for the opening of the trial, Mrs. Balfame deferred to the advice of her counsel and friends and received the women reporters, not only the four depending upon Miss Crumley, but a representative of every woman's page in New York and Brooklyn. They presented themselves in a body at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and were conducted upstairs by the fluttered Mrs. Larks, who had anticipated them with all the chairs in the jail. They crowded into the little sitting room, and given time to dispose themselves before the door leading into the bedroom opened and Mrs. Balfame entered. She bowed composedly and, with a slight diffident smile, walked to the chair reserved for her. Her weeds were relieved by white crape at the neck and wrists, but to two of the newspaper women who had interviewed her a year since, as the founder of the Friday and Country Clubs, she had lost her haunting air of girlhood. There was not a line in her beautiful skin nor a gleam of silver in her abundant brown hair, but she had suddenly entered upon the full maturity of her years, and what she may have lost in charm, they decided she had gained in subtle force. The other women agreed that she looked as cold and chaste as Diana, quite incapable of any of those mortal passions that drive fallible Earthians into crime. It was an ordeal, and she drew a long breath. You wish to interview me. Miss Sarah Austin, whose brilliant parts were generally recognized, and whose creative fervor was suspected by few, had been elected to the office of spokeswoman, and replied promptly: "Indeed we do, Mrs. Balfame, and before asking you any of the tiresome questions without which there could be no interview, we should be glad to know if you read the women's pages in our newspapers and realize that we are all friends and shout our belief in your innocence from the housetops." "Yes, oh yes," murmured Mrs. Balfame stiffly, but with a more spontaneous smile. "That is the reason I finally consented to see you. I do not like being interviewed, but you have been very kind, and I am grateful." There was a deep murmur, and after Miss Austin had thanked her prettily for her appreciation of their modest efforts, she continued in a brisk and businesslike manner: "Now, Mrs. Balfame, what we should like is your story. We have been warned by Mr. Rush that we cannot ask you whom you suspect, much less the reasons upon which you found your suspicion. Ah." Her final vocative was expressed in an angry gurgle. Rush had entered. He was so close to panic at the prospect of facing a roomful of women unsupported by a single male that his face was almost terrifying in its strength, but it had suddenly occurred to him that although these girls had agreed to write their interviews at the Dobton Inn and submit them to his censorship, it was possible one or more would slip over to New York, bent on sheer sensationalism. "You must excuse me," he said, with a valiant assault upon the lighter mood, "but my client is in the witness box, you see, and must be protected by counsel." Miss Austin swung about and faced him with a faint satiric smile. "Oh, very well," she said, "you may stay, but I for one shall not adjust my hat." It is a curious fact that newspaper women are seldom, if ever, of the masculine type. Their sheer femininity, indeed, is almost as invariable as their air of physical weariness. Not one of the little company laughed with a more than perfunctory appreciation of their captain's wit, and several stared at Rush, fascinated by his harsh masculinity, the peculiar atmosphere of tense alertness in which he seemed to have his being, the magnetism which was more an emanation from an almost perpetual concentration of his mental forces than from any of the lighter physical attributes. He folded his arms and leaned against the door, and it was only fair to the cause of woman to state that hardly one of these, whose ages ranged from 20 to 36, was unwomanly enough, despite the fact that she earned her bread in daily competition with man, to give Mrs. Balfame her whole attention thereafter. While keeping their business heads, they uncovered a corner of their hearts to the sun, and quickened, however faintly, in its glow. "Now," Miss Austin resumed, We will, counsel permitting, ask you to give us your story of that night. As you may have been misquoted, and there has been so much speculative stuff published about you, there surely can be no objection to that," and she squared her shoulders upon Mr. Rush. Mrs. Balfame looked at her counsel with a gracious deference, and he nodded. "No harm in that," he said curtly. "Tell them practically the story you would tell if you took the stand. There's only one story to tell, and it is as well the public should bear it in mind while reading the reports of the witnesses for the prosecution." "That means he's rehearsed her," whispered Miss Lauretta Lea, who had reported many trials, to Miss Tracy, who was a novice. "But that's all right." "Well, I suppose I should begin with the scene at the club. That is to say, I do not care to speak of it in detail, quite aside from a natural regard for good taste, but it seems to have been given a unique importance." "Just so," said Miss Austin encouragingly. "Do let us have your version. The public simply longs for it." "Well, I should tell you first that, although my husband was sometimes irritable, he really was a good husband, and we never had any vulgar quarrels. It was only when he was not quite himself that he sometimes said more than he meant, and he never quite forgot himself as he did that day out at the Country Club. I was playing bridge in one of the smaller rooms when I heard his voice pitched in a very excited key. I knew that something unusual had occurred, and went out into the large central room at once. There I saw him at the upper end of the room, surrounded by several of the men, who were apparently trying to induce him to leave. He was shouting and saying such extraordinary things that my first impression was that he was ill or had lost his mind. I reasoned with him, and as it did no good, and as I was deeply hurt and mortified, I left him to the men and returned to the bridge room. There, in spite of the kindness of my friends, I found I was too overcome to play, and Dr. Anna Steuer offered to drive me home. That is all as far as the scene at the clubhouse is concerned, except that I cannot sufficiently emphasize that he never had acted in a similar manner before. If he had, I should not have continued to live with him. Not that I should have obtained a divorce, for I do not approve of the institution, but I should have moved out. I have a little money of my own, left me by my father." "Ah, yes, thanks. And after you are in your own house, do you mind? Of course, we have read the story you told the men, but we should like our own story. Perhaps you may have thought of some other points since." "Yes, there are one or two. I had entirely forgotten in the agitation of that time that I went below, after packing my husband's suitcase, to get a drink of filtered water, and I thought I heard some one try the kitchen door. I also thought I heard some one upstairs, and called the name of my maid. Of course, a good deal would be made of this omission, but considering the terrible circumstances, and the fact that I never had been interviewed before, I do not find it in the least remarkable. But, of course, you want me to begin at the beginning." And in her pleasant shallow voice she told the story she had immediately concocted for her friends. As Miss Austin asked a few questions in the endeavor to inject some essence of personality into the bold story, Rush permitted the sensation of dismay with which he had listened to take implacable form. He never had heard a less convincing story on the witness stand. Mrs. Balfame had talked glibly, far too glibly. It was evident to the least initiated that she had been rehearsed. Was her mind really as colourless as her voice? Had she no sense of drama? He had hoped that the excitement of this interview, coming after weeks of supreme monotony, would kindle her to animation and a natural enrichment of vocabulary, and, witnessing its effect upon these friendly women, she would be encouraged to simulate both on the witness stand. It was a pity, he reflected bitterly, that a woman who could lie to her counsel with such a fine front of innocence could not put over the large dramatic lie that would help him so materially in his difficult task. Miss Austin, despairing of colour, made a shift with psychology. "Would you mind telling us, Mrs. Balfame, if you feel a very great dread of the trial? We realize that it must loom a terrible ordeal." Oh, of course, the mere thought of all that publicity horrifies me whenever I permit myself to think of it, but it has to be, and that is the end of it, since the real culprit will not come forward. But I feel confident I shall not break down under the strain. I might have done so if the trial had followed immediately upon my arrest, but all these weeks in jail have prepared me for anything." "But are you not terrified of the outcome? We know and rejoice that the chances are all in your favor, but men are so queer." "I am not in the least terrified. It is impossible to convict an innocent woman in this country. And then," inclining her head graciously to the watchful Rush, "I have the first criminal lawyer in Brabant County to defend me. It is a detestable thought, to be stared at in the courtroom as if I were an object in a museum, but I shall keep thinking that in a few days at most it will be over, and that I shall then return to the private life I love." "Yes, and would you mind telling us something of your plans? Shall you continue to live in Elsinore?" "I shall go far away, to Europe, if possible. I suppose I shall return in time. Of course," in a hasty afterthought, "I should not be contented for very long without my friends. They have grown to be doubly valuable and valued during this long term of incarceration. But I must travel for a while." "That is quite natural. How normal you are, dear Mrs. Balfame!" It was Miss Lauretta Lea who spoke up with enthusiasm. "You are just a sweet, serene, normal woman, who couldn't commit a violent act if you tried. Be sure the public shall see you as you are. I don't wonder your friends adore you. Don't mind being stared at. The more people that see you, the more friends you will have." Her eyes moved to Rush, and she was rewarded by a smile that expressed relief. She was a very experienced reporter and knew exactly how he felt. "And believe me," she said as they trooped down the stairs, having passed before the Balfame throne and received a limp handshake of dismissal, "that poor man's worried half to death. He'll get about as much help from her on the stand as he would from a tired codfish. But she really is a divinely sweet woman and lovely to look at, and so I'll sob over her for all I'm worth and seclude from the cynical and the sentimental that she has distilled crystal in her veins." "Did you ever know such a perfectly rotten interview?" Miss Austin was scowling fiercely. "The men did 1,000 times better because they took her by surprise, but even they cursed her. I figure out she has made up her Friday Club mind to look the marble goddess minus every female instinct, including a natural desire to shoot a brute of a husband. But I wish she had brain enough to put it over with some pep. She was afraid to be dramatic, or couldn't be, and so was trying to be literary. I don't agree with you," and arguing and scolding, they wended their disapproving way over to the Dobton Inn and sat them down at tables to make the most of their bare material. "No censorship needed here," growled Miss Austin. "She froze my very imagination." Chapter 28 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. Chapter 28 Rush walked up and down the room for a few moments in silence. Mrs. Balfame sat back and folded her hands. She was haunted by a vague sense of inefficiency, of having not quite risen to the occasion. But she felt there could be no doubt that she had not only impressed the reporters as an innocent woman, but as a perfect lady. The rest didn't matter. "Are you really not a bit nervous?" demanded Rush, swinging on his heel and confronting her. "I will not permit myself to be, and except that I hate publicity, I really do not dread the trial. It means the beginning of the end of this detestable prison life. I want to be out and free. A week in a courtroom is not too heavy a price to pay." "Have you ever been to a murder trial?" "Of course not. Such a thing would never have occurred to me." Rush sighed. She had no imagination. But as her counsel he reminded himself that he should be grateful for the lack. He wanted no scenes, either in the courtroom or here in the imminent hours. But he would have welcomed a little more feminine shrinking, appeal to his superior strength. Even when he had worshipped her from afar, she had never moved him so powerfully as on the day of her arrest, when she had flung herself over the table in an abandonment to despair as complete as the most exacting male could wish. That incident had long since taken on the shifting outlines of a dream. If she had felt any tremors since then, she had concealed them from him. "Tell me," he asked, almost wistfully, "are you not terribly frightened at times? You are alone here so much, and it has been an experience to try even a strong man's nerves." "Women nowadays really have better nerves than men. We not only lead a far fuller and more varied life than our predecessors, but you men work at such a terrific strain that it is a wonder you retain any control of your nerves at all. I will admit that I did have attacks of fear at first. It was all so strange and odd. But I got over them. You can get used to anything, I guess. And I have a strong will. I just made myself think about something else. This war has been a godsend. Have you noticed my new maps? I've really read about 20 war books, besides all the editorials, and they have given me a distaste for lighter reading, and really developed my intellect. That seems such a big word. And then I've knitted dozens of things for the children and soldiers, and felt as if I were of some use for the first time in my life." She glanced at him shyly as he stared through the bars of one of the windows. The suppressions of a lifetime made it impossible to betray any depth of feeling save under terrible stress. She was ashamed of her breakdown before him on the day of her arrest, but she was conscious of the wish that she were able to infuse her cool, even tones with warmth, to make them tremulous at the right moment. But if she attempted to betray something of her newer self, even in her eyes, self-consciousness overcame her, and she dropped the lids almost in a panic. She wondered if love broke down those cliffs of ice that seemed to encompass a new-born soul, or was it merely that the other members of her personal company, mature, jealous, self-sufficient, resented the intrusion of this shrinking alien? They had got on quite well without it. They felt no yearning for possible complications, readjustments. With all their quiet force they discouraged the stranger. Before any of the supreme experiences, including love, they might have routed, the new force might spring up in an instant like a flower from its magic soils in India. But not while the conventions bulwarked them. Their sum was Mrs. Balfame of Elsinore, and not for a moment did they permit themselves to forget it. Moreover, it was quite true that she had conquered her first apprehensions and welcomed the trial as the initial step toward freedom. Her poise had always been remarkable, the result in part of a self-centered life and a will driven relentlessly in a narrow groove. More than ever, she was determined to sit through those long days in the courtroom with the cold aloofness of the unfortunate women of history. The very ascent she had made of secret and solitary heights alone would have restored her poise, for she felt on far more friendly terms with herself than when living with a wretch she loathed, and dreaming of no higher altitudes than complete success in Elsinore. But she wished for the first time that she were a younger woman, or had made those ascents many years ago. She would have liked to reveal herself spontaneously to this interesting young man who was so deeply in love with her. Suddenly she wondered if he were as ardently in love with her as in that brief period when they had talked of themselves. Not loving him in return, she had been content with lip service, the sure knowledge that all his fine abilities were at work upon the obstacles to her freedom. She would have been deeply annoyed if he had broken the pact made on the day of her arrest and reiterated his devotion and his hopes. But significant happenings, omissions, a certain flatness. She turned her head sharply and looked at him. He was still staring moodily through the bars. If far too diffident to show the best that was in her, she found it comparatively simple to practice the feminine art of angling, albeit with a somewhat heavy hand. She asked softly,
Don't you think I did the wise thing to tell them I intended to travel as soon as I was acquitted? It surely would be in better taste than to settle down here, in that house." "Did you mean it? The intention would make a good impression on the public, certainly." "Why, of course I meant it. I am not a good hand at saying things merely for effect." "Where shall you go? Europe is rather impossible." "Oh, not altogether. There is always Italy, and there is no danger from Zeppelins in the interior of Great Britain. And there is Spain." "I think Europe a very good place for women to keep away from until the war is over. Any of the nations may become involved at any minute, ourselves for that matter. Better follow the advice of advertisers, and see America first." "Yes, I could visit the expositions in California, and camp for a while in Glacier Park. And there are the Yellowstone and Grand Cañon. But all that would only consume a few months. And then there is the winter to think of. What I feel I should do is to stay away for a year at least." "You could live very pleasantly in Southern California." "I should be very conspicuous in those small fashionable settlements. The case has been telegraphed all over the country, and I have seen dreadful pictures of myself in several Western papers." "Well, you might live quietly in New York until the war is over. There is no better place to hide, if you avoid the restaurants and theatres. And after all, even a cause célèbre is quickly forgotten if there is no aftermath. But I certainly advise against even sailing for Europe until peace is declared. There is always the danger of mines, and too enthusiastic submarines." She turned quite cold and stared at her hands. They were well shaped but large, and they looked like blocks of white marble on her black gown. He was still at the window, and his tone was listless. She had a curious sense of panic in the region of her heart. But instantly she curled her lip with defiant scorn. Was she the woman to fancy herself in love with a man the moment she seemed to be in danger of losing him? Besides, no doubt, the poor man was tired, and too absorbed in the case to have any room in him for the moods of the lover. Only a foolish, impulsive woman would in conditions like the present try to rouse a dormant passion. When she was free, and he as well, his heart would automatically take precedence once more, and he would plead ardently for the privilege of marrying her. That was quite in order. She rose briskly. "Let me show you this map," she said. "It is the very latest. Letitia Battle brought it to me 2 days ago. And do smoke." "Thanks, but I must go over and watch those girls. Yes, it is a fine map. This war certainly is a godsend. Good luck. Keep up those splendid spirits. You're all right." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 29. Oyez! 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 The Supreme Court of the State of New York, County of Brabant trial term is now in session. All people having business with this court may draw near and give their attention, and they shall be heard. The court crier delivered his morning oration in one breathless sentence, the last 5 words of which only have ever been captured by mortal ears. The roll of the jury was called. The first witness stood on the step of the witness stand and swore by the everlasting God that the testimony he would give in the trial of the people of the State of New York against the defendant would be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and then he seated himself in the chair. The trial of Mrs. Balfame began. It had taken 3 days to select a jury. If Rush was determined to keep out Germans, Mr. Gore, the district attorney, was equally reluctant to admit to the box any man whom he suspected of being under commands from his wife to get on that jury and acquit Mrs. Balfame, if he had to imperil his immortal soul. He also harbored suspicions of felonious activities on the part of Mr. Sam Cummack and certain other patriotic citizens less devoted to the cause of justice than to Elsinore. In consequence, the questions were not only uncommonly searching, but both the district attorney and the defendant's counsel exhausted their peremptory challenges. The talesmen that had crowded the courtroom beyond the railing were for the most part farmers and tradesmen.
But there were not a few prominent residents, including rooted Brabantites and busy commuters. The last answered without hesitation that they had followed the case closely from the first and formed an unalterable opinion; then, dismissed, rushed off and caught a late train for New York. Those of Mrs. Balfame's own class would have been passed cheerfully by Mr. Rush, but in spite of their careless avowals that they had been too busy to follow the case, or had found it impossible to reach any conclusion, they were peremptorily challenged by the district attorney. They too went to New York, not on business, and returned to their hearthstones as late as possible. Finally a jury of almost excessively plain men were chosen after long and weary hours of wrangling. They were all married; their ages ranged from 45 to 50. Not one looked as if he had an illusion left in regard to the sex that had shared his burdens for a quarter of a century, or, German or no German, he had any leniency in him for a woman who had presumed to abbreviate the career of a man. But at least they were real Americans, with reputations for straight dealing, and good old fashioned ideals of justice, irrespective of sex. Rush doubted if any of them could be "fixed" by Mr. Cummack or the able politicians whose services he had bespoken, although the sternest visages often hid unsuspected weak spots. But after all his best chance was with honest men whose soft spots were of another sort. So naïve had been the eagerness of the German American talesmen to get on the jury that Rush had had little difficulty in demonstrating their unfitness for duty. These were too thrifty to go to New York and stood in no fear of their wives, but they avoided the gemütlich resort of Old Dutch until the trial was over. Throughout this ordeal Mrs. Balfame sat immovable, impassive, her face a white bas relief against the heavy black crape of her veil, which hung like a black panel between her profile and the western light. Her chair was at the foot of the long table which stood beneath the two tiers of the jury box, and was reserved for counsel, the district attorney, the assistants and clerks. Her calm gray eyes looked straight ahead, interested apparently in nothing but the empty witness stand, on the right of the jury and the left of the judge. She knew that the reporters, and the few outsiders that had managed to crowd in with the talesmen, scarcely took their eyes from her face, and that the staff artists were sketching her. All her complacency had fled before certain phases of this preliminary ordeal for which no one had thought to prepare her. The constant reiteration of that question of horrid significance, "Have you any objection to capital punishment as practised in this State?" struck at the roots of her courage, enhanced her prison pallor, and the immovable battery of eyes, hostile or coldly observant, critical, appraising, made her long to grind her teeth, to rise in her chair and tell those men and women, insolent in their freedom, what she thought of their vulgar insensibility. But not for nothing had she schooled herself, and not for a moment did her nerves really threaten revolt. She had taken her second sleeping powder on the night preceding the opening of the trial, but on the third morning she awakened with the momentary wish that she had preserved Dr. Anna's poison, or could summon death in any form rather than go over to that courthouse and be tried for her life. For the first time she understood the full significance of her condition. But Mrs. Battle, Mrs. Cummack and Mrs. Gifning, when they bustled in to buck her up, congratulated her upon not having a nerve in her body, and although she had felt she must surely faint at the end of the underground tunnel between the jail and the rear of the courthouse, she had walked into that room of dread import upstairs with her head erect, her eyes level, and her hands steady. She may have built a fool's paradise for herself, assisted by her well-meaning friends, during the past 10 weeks, and dwelt in it smugly, but as it fell about her ears she stood erect, with a real courage that strengthened her soul for any further shocks and surprises this terrible immediate future of hers might hold. On the first day, although she never glanced at a talesman, she had listened eagerly to every question, every answer, every challenge. As the third day wore on she felt only weariness of mind, and gratitude that she had a strong back. She was determined to sit erect and immobile if the trial lasted a month. And not only was her personal pride involved.
Circumstances had delivered her to the public eye, therefore it should receive an indelible impression of a worthy representative of the middle class American of the smaller town, so little unlike the women of the wealthier class, and capable of gracing any position to which fate might call her. A type the United States of America alone has bred; also of a woman whose courage and dignity had never been surpassed by any man brought to the bar of justice on the awful charge of murder. She knew that this attitude, as well as her statuesque appearance, would antagonize the men reporters but enchant her loyal friends, the women. Her estimate was very shrewd. The poor sob sisters, squeezed in wherever they could find a vacant chair, or even a half of one, all the tables being reserved for the men, surrendered in a body to her cold beauty, her superb indifference, soul and pen. A unanimous verdict of guilty brought in by that gum-chewing, small-headed jury merely would petrify these women's belief in her innocence. She was vicarious romance, for women that write too much have little time to live and no impulse to murder anyone in the world but the city editor. On the morning of the fourth day the space between the enclosure and the walls of the courtroom was filled with spectators from all over the county, many of them personal friends of Mrs. Balfame. But New York City would not become vitally interested until the business of examining the minor witnesses was concluded. Behind and at the left of Mrs. Balfame were the members of her intimate circle. Occasionally they whispered to her, and she smiled so sweetly and with such serene composure that even the men reporters admitted she looked younger and more feminine, and more handsome, than on that day of the interview which had proved her undoing. "But she did it all right," they assured one another. They must believe in her guilt or suffer twinges in that highly civilized and possibly artificial section of the brain tabulated as conscience. Their fixed theory was that she had mixed the poison for Balfame and then, being in a highly nervous state and apprehensive that he would capriciously refuse to drink it, had snatched her pistol as she heard his voice in the distance, dashed downstairs and out into the grove, and fired with her established accuracy. She had had plenty of time between the crime and her arrest to pass the pistol to one of her friends, or even to slip out at night and drop it in the marsh. As to the shot that had missed Balfame and entered the tree, it was either by one of those coincidences more frequent in fact than in fiction that another enemy of Balfame's had been lurking in the grove, intent upon murder, or the bullet hole was older than they had inferred. The idea of a lover they scoffed at openly, and it was one of the established facts, as they reminded their sisters of the press, that the worst women in history had looked like angels, statues, or babies. They had also possessed powerful sex magnetism, and this the handsome defendant wholly lacked. The theory of the women reporters was far simpler. She hadn't done it, and that was the end of it. The judge, a tall, imposing man with inherited features and accumulated flesh, very stately and remote in his flowing silk gown, looked unspeakably bored for 3 days, but was visibly hopeful as he swept up to his seat on the rostrum on Thursday morning. As the Justice for Brabant, Mr. Bascom, had not been on speaking terms with the deceased, and as his wife was one of the defendant's closest friends, an eminent Supreme Court justice from one of the large neighboring cities had been assigned to the case. The reporters of the evening newspapers were packed closely about a long table parallel with the one just below the jury box, and behind were 4 or 5 smaller tables dedicated to the morning stars. A large number of favored spectators had found seats within the railings, but a passage was kept open for the boys who came up at regular intervals to get copy from the evening table for the telegraph operator below stairs. Broderick's seat beneath the rostrum commanded both the witness box and Mrs. Balfame. He had used his influence to have Alys Crumley assigned to the position of artist for the woman's page of the News, and she and Sarah Austin shared a chair. The trial began. Dr. Lequeur established the fact of the death, described the course of the bullet, demonstrating that it had been fired by someone concealed in the grove. A surveyor followed and exhibited to the jury a map of the house and grounds. 3 of the younger members of the Country Club, Mr. John Bradshaw Battle,
cashier of the Elsinore Bank, Mr. Lemuel Cummack, son of Elsinore's esteemed citizen, Mr. Son Cummack, and Mr. Leonard Corfine, a commuter, had been subpoenaed after a matching of wits. Overawed by the solemnity of the oath, they gave a circumstantial account of the quarrel which had preceded the murder but a few hours, all, in spite of constant interruptions from the defendant's counsel, conveying the impression, however unwillingly, that Mrs. Balfame had been livid with wrath and the man who had been her husband insufferable. It was a master stroke of the district attorney to open his case with the damaging testimony of two members of the loyal Elsinore families. As for Mr. Corfine, although born and brought up without the pale, he had been graciously received upon electing to build his nest in Elsinore, and his young wife was one of Mrs. Balfame's meekest admirers. Mr. Broderick muttered "H'm, h'm," and Mr. Bruce squirmed round from the evening table and jerked his eyebrows at his seniors. "Bad, bad," muttered Mr. Broderick's neighbour. "But watch her nerve. Can you beat it? She hasn't batted an eyelash." Two former servants that had preceded Frieda in the Balfame ménage testified that the household consisted of three people only, the master and mistress and the one in help. A gardener came 3 times a week in the morning. No, none of the old spare rooms was now furnished, and the Balfames never had visitors overnight. The prosecution rested, and Mr. Rush approached the bar according to usage and asked that the case be dismissed. The judge ruled that it should proceed, and immediately after the noon recess the first witness for the defense was called. This was Mr. Cummack, and he testified vigorously to the harmonious relations of the deceased and his amiable wife; that Mrs. Balfame, who was always pale, had treated the episode out at the club in the casual manner observed by all seasoned and intelligent wives, the conversation over the telephone in his house proving that the domestic heavens were swept clean of storm clouds, and that the deceased had departed for his home quite happy and singing at the top of his lungs. He had often remarked jocularly he was a cheery and jocular temperament that he expected to die with his boots on, especially since he had taken to bawling Tipperary in the face of American Germany. It is not to be imagined that Mr. Cummack was able to deliver himself of this valuable testimony without frequent and indignant interruptions from the district attorney, whose irrelevant, incompetent and immaterial rang through the courtroom like the chorus of a Gilbert and Sullivan opera. Mr. Gore, a wasp of a man, with snapping black eyes and a rasping voice emitted through his higher nasal passages, succeeded in having much of this testimony stricken out, but not before the wily Mr. Rush, who stood on tiptoe, as alert and nervous as a racehorse at the grandstand, had, by his adroit swift questions, fairly flung it into the jury box. It was of the utmost importance, with an obstinate provincial jury, to establish at once a favorable general impression of the prisoner. When, in the theatre, a trial scene is depicted, it is necessary to interpose dramatic episodes; but no one misses these adventitious incidents in a real trial for murder, so dramatic is the bare fact that a human being is battling for his life. When the prisoner at the bar is a woman reasonably young and good looking, the interest is so intense and complete that the sudden intrusion of one of the incidents which have become the staples of the theatre, such as the real culprit rushing into the courtroom and confessing himself, a suicide in the witness box, or dramatic conduct on the part of the defendant, would be resented by the spectators as an anti-climax. Real drama is too logical and grimly progressive to tolerate the extrinsic. The 3 other men who had been at Mr. Cummack's house that night were called, and corroborated his story. They all wore an expression of gentle amusement, as if the bare idea of the stately and elegant Mrs. Balfame descending to play even a passive rôle in a domestic row was as unthinkable as that any woman could find aught in David Balfame to rouse her to ire. "By Jove!" whispered Mr. Broderick to Mr. Wagstaff of the Morning Flag, "just figure to yourself what the line would be if she had been caught red-handed and was putting up a defense of temporary insanity caused by the well-known proclivities of that beast. A good subject for a cartoon would be Dave Balfame in heaven with a tin halo on, whitewashing Mrs. B., weeds and all. The human mind is nothing but a sewer." The afternoon session was also enlivened by the testimony of several of the ladies who had been members of the bridge party on the day of Mr. Balfame's unseemly conduct at the club. They testified that although Mrs. Balfame naturally dissolved upon her return to the card room, there had been nothing whatever in her demeanour to suggest seething passion. Mrs. Battle, who was an imposing figure in the witness chair, her greater bulk being above the waist, tossed her head and asseverated with refined emphasis that Mrs. Balfame was one of those rare and exquisite beings that are temperamentally incapable of passion of any sort. Her immediate return to her home was prompted more by delicacy than even by pain. Miss Crumley's pencil faltered as she listened. She could not give a jeering public even a faithful outline of a woman as devoted to the sacred cause of friendship and Elsinore as Mrs. Battle. The testimony of none of these ladies was more emphatic than that of Mrs. Bascom, wife of the supplanted justice, and she added unexpectedly that she had been so upset herself that she too had left the clubhouse immediately, and, her swift car passing Dr. Anna Steuer's little runabout, she had seen Mrs. Balfame chatting pleasantly and without a trace of recent emotion. Mrs. Balfame almost relaxed the set curves of her mouth at this surprising statement. She recalled that a car had passed, and that she had wondered at the time if anyone had noticed her extreme agitation. She kept her muscles in order, but unconsciously her eyes followed Mrs. Bascom as she left the witness chair, with an expression of puzzled gratitude. The district attorney turned to the reporters with a short, sardonic laugh, and Mr. Broderick shook his head as he murmured to Mr. Wagstaff: "Can you beat that? And yet they say women don't stand by one another." "Good for the whole game, I guess," replied the young flag star, who was enamoured of a very pretty suffragette. The judge rose and the afternoon session was over. The great case of the People vs. Mrs. Balfame rested until the following morning. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 30. Mrs. Balfame walked back through the now familiar tunnel more hopeful and elated than anyone in the courtroom would have inferred from her chiseled manner. "I almost feel that I have the courage to look at the sketches of myself in the papers," she said lightly to Rush, who escorted her. "I haven't dared open a paper since Monday morning." "Better not." Rush also was in high spirits. "Keep your mental mercury as high as possible. It doesn't matter, anyhow. You'll be clear in less than a week. The impression all those splendid friends of yours created knock the prosecution silly." "I have not once glanced at the jury," said Mrs. Balfame proudly, "and I never shall. All I was conscious of was that they were chewing gum and that the man above me snorts constantly. That's Houston. He's likely to be predisposed in your favour on account of your intimacy with Dr. Anna, and he's a just man of some intelligence. I fancy none of them is in the mood to be too hard on anyone, for they are having a fine vacation in the Paradise City Hotel. Each has a big room with a soft bed and rich and delicate food 3 times a day. If they don't get indigestion, they will be inclined to mercy on general principles. I engineered the housing of them. Gore was all for putting them up at the Dobton Inn, where they would have grown as vicious as starved dogs. I won my point by reminding him that certain men of that sort try to get on a jury for the sake of having a rest and a soft time, and if they aren't coddled they are equal to falling ill and forcing the court to begin the trial over again. You're all right." They were in the jail sitting room, and she stood with her head thrown back and her eyes shining. The moment they had entered she had removed her heavy hat and veil and run her hands through her crushed hair. Rush, who was very nervous and excited, made a swift motion forward as if to seize her hands, but it was only later, when alone, that she realized that possibly she had brushed aside an opportunity to rekindle a flame which she alternately feared and doubted was burning low. She was not thinking of him, and exclaimed happily: "It is quite a wonderful sensation to feel that you have made friends like that. My, how they did lie, and so convincingly! For a moment I was quite the outsider, and deeply impressed with the weakness of the case against the accused. Here they come. I feel as if I never really loved them before." And she ran to the door to admit the elated trio who had that day made their noblest sacrifice to the cause of friendship. Mrs. Balfame kissed them and embraced them, and dried their excited tears, while Rush, his contemptible part in the day's drama forgotten, slunk down the stairs and out of the jail. He met Alys Crumley as she was about to board the trolley for Elsinore, and she stepped back and congratulated him warmly. "Your brain worked like blades of chain lightning," she said with real enthusiasm. "I know you have only begun, but I can well imagine. Wasn't Mrs. Balfame delighted?" "With her friend's testimony," he replied gloomily. "I don't seem to come in." There are some impulses, born of sudden opportunity, too strong for mortal powers of resistance. "Come home to supper," said Miss Crumley, with the same spontaneous warmth. "You look so tired, and mother promised me Maryland chicken and waffles. Besides, I want to show you my drawings. I'm so proud of being a staff artist." "I'll come," said Rush promptly. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 31. The following day was also taken by the examination of witnesses for the defence. Dr. Lequeur, who had been called in occasionally by the Balfames when Dr. Anna was unavailable, and who was also an old friend of the family, asserted that so far as he knew there never had been a quarrel between husband and wife. Mrs. Balfame, in fact, was unique in his experience, inasmuch as she never looked depressed nor shed tears. He was followed by a woman who had been general housemaid in the Balfame home for 3 years. She had left it to reward the devotion of a plumber, and between her and Frieda there had been a long line of the usual incompetents. Mrs. Figg testified with an enthusiasm which triumphed over nerves and grammar, and although she guessed Mr. Balfame was about like other husbands, especially at breakfast, Mrs. Balfame was too easy going to mind. She'd never seen her mad. Yes, she was an exacting mistress, all right, terrible particular, and she never sat with the hired girl in the kitchen and gossiped, and you couldn't take a liberty with her like you could with some. But that was just her way, naturally proud and silent like. She was terrible economical, but a kind mistress, and she didn't scold and follow up, once she was sure the girl would suit, and not a bit mean about evenings and afternoons off. She did up her own room and dusted the downstairs rooms, except for the weekly cleaning. No, she'd never seen no pistol. It wasn't her way to look in bureau drawers. No, she'd never seen or heard of any jealousy, tempers, and so forth, and had always taken it for granted that Mrs. Balfame wasn't on to Mr. Balfame's doings, or, if she was, she didn't care. There was lots like that. The district attorney snarled and trumpeted through his placid recital, but Mrs. Figg took no notice of him whatever. She had been thoroughly drilled, and looked straight into the sparkling blue eyes of Mr. Rush as if hypnotized. Other minor witnesses consumed the afternoon, and once more Mrs. Balfame returned to the jail with glowing eyes. The women reporters were elated. The men made no comment as they filed out of the courtroom, but their whole bearing expressed a lofty and quiet scorn. "It's fine, fine!" exclaimed Cummack, sitting down beside Rush at the table below the empty jury box. "But I do wish Dr. Anna was available. She stands head and shoulders above everyone else in the estimation of these jurymen. She doctored the children and confined the wives of pretty nearly all of them. There's no stone she wouldn't leave unturned." "She's pretty bad, isn't she?" asked Rush. "Would there be any chance at all of getting a deposition, in case things went wrong?" Things ain't going wrong, but as for Anna, she's out of it, and everything else, I guess. I was out at the hospital yesterday, for I've had her in mind, and although she was better for a time, she's worse again. But say, what do you think I discovered? Those damned newspaper men have been hanging round out there. That young devil, Broderick." Rush was sitting up very straight, his eyes glittering. "But he surely hasn't been able to see her. I don't believe any sort of graft would get by Mrs. Dissosway." "You bet he hasn't been able to see Anna, and just now they're not leaving her for a moment alone, like they did at first. But Broderick seems to have the idea wedged in his brain that Mrs. Balfame confessed to Anna, and that poor old Doc lost the pistol somewhere in the marsh." Rush made an exclamation of disgust. "I can't understand Broderick. He's got his trial all right, and it isn't like him to hound a woman. I said so much to him, and though he wouldn't talk much, I gathered from something he let fall that he was afraid if the crime wasn't well fixed into Enid, some innocent person he thought a lot more of might come under suspicion. Can you guess who he had in mind?" Rush pushed back his chair and sprang to his feet. "Good Lord, no! One case at a time is all my brain is equal to." He was almost out of the empty courtroom when Cummack caught him firmly by the shoulder. "Say, Dwight," he said with evident embarrassment, "hold on a minute. I've just got to tell you that somehow or other I sensed you when Broderick was trying to put me off. There are a good many things. They've been coming back." Rush turned the hard glittering blue of his eyes full upon Mr. Cummack, whose shrewd but kindly gaze faltered for a moment. "Do you believe I did it?" demanded Rush. "Well, no, not exactly. That is, I'd know that if you had done it, it would have been because you got the idea into your head that Enid was having an awful row to hoe, or because he'd attacked her that night. It wouldn't have been for no mean personal reason, and no one knows better than I that the blood goes to the head terrible easy at your age when a beautiful woman is in question. If I'd guessed it before, I'm free to say I'd have rushed your arrest in order to spare Enid, if for no other reason. But as it's gone so far, and she's sure to get off, and you wouldn't stand much show, the matter had best stay where it is, particularly well, I may as well tell you Enid sort of confided to Polly that you had offered to cover her name with yours as soon as she got out, and if you've been in love with her all this time, as I guess you have been, well, Dave can't be brought back, and well, I've lived out West, and it isn't so uncommon there for a man to shoot on sight when he's mad about a woman and a few other things at the same time. Dave was my friend, but I guess I understand." Rush had withdrawn stiffly from the friendly hand laid on his shoulder. "I have asked Mrs. Balfame to marry me," he said, "but she has by no means consented." "But she means to. Don't let it worry you. Women are queer cattle. Nail her next time she's in the melting mood. She gets 'em oftener than she ever did before, and I guess you see her alone often enough." "Oh yes, I've seen her alone nearly every day for 10 weeks." Cummack narrowed his eyes, and his face, generally relaxed and amiable, grew stern and menacing. "You don't love her," he exclaimed. "You don't. Like many another damned fool, you've compromised your very life for a woman, only to be disenchanted by seeing too much of her. But by God, you've got to marry her." They were standing at the head of the winding stair in the rotunda, and several of the reporters were still in front of the telephone booth below. "Hush!" said the lawyer peremptorily. "I mean to marry Mrs. Balfame if she accepts the proposal I made to her the day she was arrested. I have nothing to warrant your jumping to the conclusion that I no longer wish to marry her. But by God, if you ever dare to threaten me again," and he raised his fist so menacingly, his set face was so tense and white, his eyes bore such a painful resemblance to hot coals, that Cummack retreated hastily. All right," he called up from the first turning. "Don't fancy I think I could. But what's passed between us is sacred. S'long." Chapter 32. CHAPTER XXXII of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 32. On the morrow the first witness called by the prosecution in rebuttal was old Kraus, and now it was Mr. Rush's turn to shout immaterial, irrelevant and incompetent, so that it was well nigh impossible for the jury to do more than guess what the choleric person with a strong German accent was talking about. The district attorney fought valiantly to draw forth the story of Frieda's nocturnal visit to the Kraus home in search of advice after hearing Mrs. Balfame enter the kitchen from the yard, but his efforts ended in a shouting contest between the prosecution and the defense, both deserting their positions before the jury box and wrangling before the judge like two angry schoolboys. Alys Crumley longed to laugh aloud, but not so the judge. He asked them curtly how he was to know what was their point of dispute if they both talked at once. He then commanded Mr. Rush to state in as few words as possible what he was objecting to, and when the counsel for the defense had stated his purely legal reasons for blocking this purely hearsay testimony, the judge abruptly threw Mr. Kraus out of court. Rush, flushed and triumphant, returned to his chair below the jury box, and Mr. Gore sulkily called the name of Miss Frieda Appel. There was no question of poor Frieda's making a good personal impression upon spectators or jury, no matter how worthy her motives. She had saved almost every penny of her wages since coming to America. It had been her lover's intention to emigrate to Brabant County as soon as his term of service was over, and her housewifely intention to greet him with a furnished cottage. Since the war began she had sent all her savings to East Prussia lest her people starve. Dress in any circumstances would never tempt her. Economy was her religion, and she cherished no illusions about her face and form. To-day she wore a skirt of an old voluminous cut and a jacket with high puckered sleeves. The color had once been brown. Her coarse blonde hair met her eyebrows in a thick bang, and its high knob was surmounted by a tailor hat a size too small. Her thick-set body was uncorseted, and her indeterminate features were lost in the width and flatness of her face. Only the little eyes beneath the heavy thatch of hair alternately glowed dully and spat fire. The judge sternly suppressed the titter that ran over the courtroom as this caricature mounted the witness stand, and the district attorney, in spite of frequent interruptions, elicited a remarkably clear and coherent statement. The judge sustained him, for here was a real witness, and Miss Appel not only had been as thoroughly rehearsed as Mrs. Figg, but she had a neat, precise little mind set with rows of pigeon-holes that ejected their contents in routine when her coach pressed the cognate button. She had come home abruptly from the dance-hall, as she had an insupportable toothache, had run all the way, as she had some toothache drops in her room. She was in such agony she hardly had noticed that her friend Conrad Kraus was behind her. When she reached her room she had applied the drops, and to her horror they made the pain worse. After walking the floor for perhaps 10 minutes, she didn't know or care whether it was 10 or 15 minutes, she was just starting to go downstairs and heat some water for her bag, when she heard the kitchen door open and shut. She held her breath and did not answer when Mrs. Balfame called, as she feared she was wanted and was determined to do nothing for anybody while her tooth ached like that. Mrs. Balfame's voice had sounded quite breathless, as if she had been running. In a moment Frieda heard her go into the dining-room, then back to the kitchen, and turn on the tap, not the filter, which made no noise, and then she heard one glass clink against another on the pantry shelf. After that Mrs. Balfame went upstairs from the front hall, and the witness returned to her room and threw herself on the bed, where she remained until Mr. Cummack came and asked her to go downstairs and make coffee. By this time her tooth ached, so she didn't care what she did. Cross-questioned, she admitted that Mrs. Balfame was in the habit of drinking a glass of filtered water the last thing at night. No, she had not heard her go out, but only come in. But why, if Mrs. Balfame saw nothing outside to frighten her, or if she hadn't been out, was she so short of breath? As may be imagined, mere speculation on Miss Apple's part was cut short by Mr. Rush, who interrupted her constantly. Yes, she had heard what she now knew had been a shot, but she had paid no attention. Who would, with a red hot iron forcing one's tooth down through one's jaw? Even the scornful questions of counsel, which forced her to admit that she had lied to the coroner, neither perturbed her nor made any impression on jury, press, or spectators. Every one present had suffered from toothache, and two farmers in the box showed their tusks in an appreciative grin when she replied tartly that she didn't know or care anything that day but tooth, tooth, tooth. It was manifest that she was far too conservative to have had it out at once, to say nothing of the cost. The only question she was not prepared for was the abrupt challenge of Mr. Rush as to how she could prove that young Kraus had followed her if she had neither seen nor spoken to him during that short run from Main Street. But although she was visibly perturbed at being confronted with a set of words to which no neat little pigeon hole responded, it was so evident she was firmly convinced her friend had accompanied her, that for Rush to make too much of his solitary point would prejudice his case, and he let her go. Conrad Jr. followed, and his story was equally straightforward. He also made a good impression. True, he had a very small, closely cropped head, with eyes too small and ears too large, but he held himself with arrogance, and he was well dressed in a new gray suit and pink shirt. Born in the United States, it was manifest that he was proud not only of being an American citizen, but of the country's choicest vintage. He had been sent to the public school until he was 16, had studied conscientiously, and his grammar was quite as good as that of the district attorney, who in emotional moments confused his negatives. But even Rush, whose advantages had been as superior as his natural equipment, became a good nasal American when excited, opened into vowels, and freely translated "you" into "yer." It is these persistent characteristics, so racy of the soil, which cheer us when apprehending that our original Americanism may in time be obliterated by the foreign influx. No, said young Kraus, he had no sentimental interest in Frieda. He smiled. And he was engaged to a young lady to whom he had been attentive for 3 years. But he felt like a brother to Frieda. She had come to his father's house direct from Germany, their families having been friends for generations. It was not only his duty but his pleasure to dance with her, she being the best of the bunch down at the Hall. As he was dancing with her when her toothache became unendurable, it was natural that he should see her home. In fact, he always saw her home when it was convenient. Of course, if he had to catch the last trolley for Dobton in a hurry, that was another matter. When she had entered the house, he had waited, thinking she might want some other drops or possibly a dentist. Once, when he had had a toothache, he had been obliged to go to a dentist's house at night. His papa had sent him, and naturally he thought of it as a possibility in Frieda's case. Then the kitchen door opened and a woman came out. At this point the interest in the courtroom became intense. Even the blasé young reporters sat forward, their pencils poised. The judge wheeled his chair to the right and stared down fixedly at the back of young Kraus's head. The district attorney balanced himself on his heels, his thumbs hooked in the sleeves of his vest, and Rush stood with his back curved as if to spring down the witness's throat with a wild yell of "Immaterial, irrelevant, and incompetent." Only Mrs. Balfame sat like a statue that had neither eyes to see nor ears to hear. Yes, Mr. Kraus recognized Mrs. Balfame's figure and walk. She was 1 in 1,000 for looks, and taller than many men. She had on a long dark ulster and a black scarf round her head. The kitchen light was behind her. Here there was another furious contest between the chief counsel and the district attorney, but the judge ordered the young man, who had consumed a toothpick imperturbably, to proceed with his story. Mrs. Balfame had slipped round the corner of the house, listened intently, walked for a minute toward the back of the grounds he could just see the moving shadow in the darkness turned abruptly and entered the grove. Naturally interested, he waited to see what she was up to, and then, possibly 3 or 4 minutes later, he heard Balfame singing "Tipperary," and a moment or two after that the shot. One shot, not two. He took no stock in the theory that there had been two shots, followed by loud voices from the other side of the avenue. Then he beat it, that being his natural instinct at the moment. His papa had taught him to be cautious and to keep clear of other people's fights. He had never been close up against a crime, and he hoped he never should be. He walked through the adjoining grounds at the back, and then into Balfame Street, and took the next trolley home. He didn't feel like dancing after what he guessed had happened. No, he had heard no sound of running footsteps, but he stood for a moment near the back fence of the liqueur place. There were people in the library, until some man ran in calling for the doctor to come at once. And he did see a car leave the lane behind the Balfame place. He had thought nothing of it, however, as automobiles were everywhere all the time. No, he hadn't tried to see whether the car was driven by a man or woman, or how many occupants it had. Not only was the night very dark, as far as he remembered the car had no lamps, but his one idea was to get out of the neighbourhood. Rush put him through a grilling cross examination, and although he could not shake his testimony, he made use of all his practised arts to exhibit the youth as a sorry coward who ran away when he heard a revolver shot, instead of rushing with the common instinct of American manhood to ascertain if it were the woman herself who had been the victim. How much had he been paid to give this testimony withheld at the coroner's inquest? Young Kraus's ruddy hues had deepened to purple some time since, and he shouted back that he had come forward only when that woman's lying friends were trying to fasten the crime upon his innocent papa. Here he was sternly admonished by the Judge to confine his answers to yes and no, unless he could control his temper. Rush forced him to reiterate that he had not had a glimpse of Mrs. Balfame's face that night, that he never had spoken to her at any time, and the lawyer remarked crushingly that the young man's brain must have been in a hopelessly confused state if he saw a car leave the lane so soon after the shooting, a car, moreover, without lights, and failed to connect this phenomenon with the immediately previous sound of a pistol shot. It was evident that his brain moved so slowly that it had taken him almost a week to put a good story together. Young Kraus left the stand with his inborn sense of superiority over mere Americans severely shaken. But although his small angry eyes encountered more than one sneer, and many of those hostile spectators looked as if they would laugh outright were it not for their awe of the Judge, he had injured Mrs. Balfame far more than himself. Few believed him to be lying, or that he had seen a vision, not a real woman, leave the Balfame house by the kitchen door. He was known to have been as sober as usual on the night of the dance, and as the evidence against his father had been regarded as fantastic from the first, there was no conceivable cause for him to lie. Mr. Gifning, Mr. Battle, and Mr. Carden, who were the first to reach Balfame after he fell, were forced by the district attorney to give damning evidence against Mrs. Balfame. Her room was in the front of the house. If in it, she could have heard the shot as plainly as they on Mr. Gifning's veranda. But she did not come downstairs or manifest herself in any way until they had had time to summon the coroner, who, to be sure, lived round the corner, and Dr. Lequeur. It must have been quite 6 minutes before she opened her window and demanded the reason for the disturbance at her gate. At least, it had seemed that long. No, they never confused a revolver shot with a bursting tire. They had when cars first came into use, but they had learned to differentiate long since. When Mr. Rush asked them sarcastically why one at least of the party had not searched the grove and attempted to catch the murderer, they replied they had by no means been sure that the shot had come from the grove. It might have come from anywhere. It was only after the doctor's examination that the direction of the bullet had been agreed upon. Later they did search the grove with a dark lantern brought from Mrs. Gifning's house. In fact, they searched every inch of the grounds, and their only reward was abuse from the police. These three witnesses, examined after the noon recess, occupied very little time. It was at 10 minutes to 4 that the district attorney electrified everyone in the courtroom by calling to the stand a man whose name up to that moment had not been mentioned in the case. The reporters looked deeply annoyed. Even Mrs. Balfame raised her head a trifle higher, as if listening. Rush's pale face was paler. The lines in it seemed deeper, as he sprang to his feet, alert at once, his nostrils expanding. The district attorney balanced himself on his heels, his thumbs in his waistcoat armholes, a grin of triumph on his sharp little face. The name called was James Mott, and it was borne by a highly reputable drummer who had made sales for many years to houses carrying general merchandise, including that of Balfame and Cummack. Mr. Mott was as well known in Brabant County as any of its inhabitants. In fact, he was engaged to an estimable young lady of Elsinore, and hence, so it soon transpired, had happened to be in town on the fatal night. For once the acumen of the district attorney had proved more penetrating than that of the brilliant counsel for the defense. Mr. Mott took the stand. He was a clean-shaven, upstanding American, with the keen eye and grim mouth of the travelling salesman who knows that he must do or die. He looked as honest as urbane, and for the first time Mrs. Balfame's heart sank, and her hands, so the women reporters noted for the benefit of the public, clenched for a full minute. Although Rush stood with his head stretched forward, he thought it wise to let the man tell his story in his own way. Interruptions would have been of little avail. The judge would sustain the district attorney if it were patent the witness were telling the truth, and as he was completely in the dark himself, it were better to wait until he got a promising lead. He knew that no man's brain could work more quickly than his. Mr. Mott, being solemnly sworn, deposed that on the night of the shooting he had been taking supper with his friend Miss Lack, who lived at No. 3 Dawbarn Street, just round the corner from Elsinore Avenue. He left her house a little before 8, as he was obliged to catch the 8:10 for New York. As he closed the gate behind him, he saw David Balfame walk unsteadily past, shouting "Tipperary," and being a friend of many years' standing, had concluded to follow and see Balfame safely inside the house. He would lose but a minute or two, and it seemed to him a decent act, for it was possible the man might fall and hurt himself before he reached his home. Mott was so close behind him that he must have just escaped the shot or shots himself, and although he jumped backward he saw distinctly somebody run out of the grove and toward the back of the house. Whether it was a man or a woman he had no idea, but the figure was tall, yes, far taller than either young Kraus or Frieda. Then, he said, he doubled on his tracks and got back into Dawbarn Street as quickly as he could. He blushed as he admitted this, but added that he knew from the shouts on Gifning's veranda that men were hastening to Balfame's aid, and he had to catch the 8:10 or lose his night train to the west and a big piece of business. Moreover, he didn't like the idea of giving testimony against anybody. He abhorred the institution of capital punishment. For the same reason he did not come forward until the district attorney ferreted him out, as he was afraid the running figure might have been Mrs. Balfame, and she was the last person he wished to harm, innocent or guilty. No one could doubt that he told the truth and hated to tell it, nor could anyone jump to the conclusion that he was the assassin. He had as little motive for killing Balfame as any of the other men of Brabant County, with whom he had been for years on the same cordial terms. All that Rush could do was to make him admit that perhaps he was naturally confused by the flash, the report almost in his ear, the man sinking at his feet, and only fancied he saw a running form. The delusion would be natural in the circumstances, particularly as his thoughts seemed to have been concentrated upon getting out of the way. Mr. Mott admitted almost too eagerly that this might be true. but added that when the district attorney, who was a cousin of Miss Lack, as well as an old friend of his own, had squeezed the story out of him bit by bit (the form of extraction was supplied by Mr. Rush), that had been his impression. He seemed to have that tall running figure imprinted upon his retina, as it were. Of course it might be just imagination. He wished to God he could swear it was. When asked sharply if even one of his parents was German, he recovered his poise and replied haughtily that he was straight American and as pro-Allies as the best man in the country. He had never entered Old Dutch's beer garden; his choice was a hotel bar, anyhow; he avoided saloons. Rush had a diabolical power of making a witness look ridiculous, but the American mind is essentially a just mind, normally unemotional, and a very magnet for facts. As the Judge adjourned the court until Monday, the sob sisters trailed out dejectedly, after a vain endeavour to get close to Mrs. Balfame. The young men sauntered forth, with their heads in the air, and Rush's lips were so closely pressed together that his face looked pure granite. As a matter of fact, his heart felt like water. Mrs. Balfame, who had not permitted herself to show a flicker of interest while Mott was on the stand, rose as the Judge left the room. She smiled upon each of her friends, separately, and kissed the prominent ladies of Elsinore who had sat beside her throughout the trying day. "Please don't come over to the jail," she said. "I know you are worn out, and I have a bad headache. I must lie down. But do, please, come to morrow. You are all too good. Thank you so much." Then, with a faint smile and a light step, she followed the sheriff through the long tunnel, a horrible vision dancing before her eyes. Chapter 33 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 33 When Rush arrived at the sitting room of the jail's private suite, he found Mrs. Balfame, not in tears as he had nervously anticipated, but distraught, pacing the room, her hands in her disordered hair. "I'm done for, done for!" she cried, as Rush hastily closed the door. "It would have been better if I had told the truth in the beginning, that I had gone out that night. It was not such a bad excuse, that I thought I saw a burglar down there, and it was God's truth. Or I could have said I was walking about the grounds because I had a headache. It would never have gone down. If I could have discovered who the other person in the grove was, found him, and his .41 caliber revolver, well and good. Failing that, our line of defence is the best possible. I will admit, though," he too was pacing the room, "it looks bad to day, pretty bad. There isn't the ghost of a chance to prove Mott was the man. Gore has the time to the minute he left Susie Lack's. You must have gone out some time before." "Oh, he didn't do it. I've not thought it for a moment. No such luck. It was some enemy who went straight to New York in that car. But I Auburn, the electric chair, they all believed oh, my God God " She had tossed her arms above her head, then flung herself down before the table, her face upon them, rocking her body back and forth. Her voice was deep with horror and despair, her abandonment far more complete than on the day of her arrest; and wrought up, himself, Rush was stirred with the echo of all he had felt that day. In the semi-intimacy of these past 10 weeks, when he had talked with her for hours at a time, she had disillusioned him in many ways, bored him, forced him to admit that her lovely shell concealed an uninteresting mind, and that the only depths in her personality that he was permitted to glimpse were such as to make him shrink, by no means to excite that fascination even in repulsion peculiar to the faults of a more passionate nature. He still thought her the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, however, and if it was beauty which now left him cold, his admiration of her had been renewed these last 3 days, when her manner and appearance in court had been beyond all praise. He had excoriated himself for his fickleness, his contemptible failure as a lover, and the more he hated himself, the more grimly determined he was to behave precisely as if he still loved and revered her as he had when ready to sacrifice life itself for her sake. He was in such an impasse that he cared little what became of himself. He leaned over the table and pressed his hands hard on her arms. "Listen," he said peremptorily. "You never will go to Auburn. You will leave this jail not later than the middle of next week, a free woman. If I cannot get you off by my address to the jury, and it will be the supreme effort of my life, I'll take the stand and swear that I committed the murder myself." "What?" She lifted her head and stared up at him. His face was set, but his eyes glowed like blue coals. "Yes, I can put it over all right. You remember I went to your house from the club that day. Nobody saw me go, no one saw me leave. From the moment I left you until the following morning no one that I know of, saw me that night except Dr. Anna. We met out on the road leading to Houston's farm, and she drove me in. She believes I did it. So does Cummack, and if necessary he will manage to get an affidavit from her." Mrs. Balfame had sprung to her feet. "Did you do it? Did you? Aha! I can make even you believe it. No, I did not. But I couldn't prove an alibi if my life depended upon it. I can make the judge and the jury believe." "And do you think I would permit—" "They will believe me. And Dr. Anna. Who would doubt her testimony that my appearance and conduct were highly suspicious that night on the marsh road? And what could you disprove? There was a man in that grove, was there not?" "Yes, but not you. I don't know why, but I could swear to that. I shall, if you do anything so mad. Tell the whole truth about myself." "What good would that do? Balfame was killed with a '41 revolver. Yours was a '38." "How do you know that?" "I found it the night I spent in your house, the night of your arrest. I knew that you never would have gone out to head off a burglar without a revolver, any more than the jury would have believed it. I found the pistol. Never mind the long and many details of the search. It is in my safe. I kept it on the off chance that it might be necessary to produce it after all." "But I fired at him. I hardly knew that I was firing until I felt the revolver in my hand go off. Perhaps it was a suggestion from that tense figure so close to me, intent upon murder. Perhaps I merely felt I must. I have never been able to analyze what I did feel in those terrible seconds. It doesn't matter. I did. And you know I fired with intent to kill. Did you guess at once?" "Oh, yes, but it doesn't matter. You were not yourself, of course. You had what is called an inhibition, as maddened people have when fighting their way out of a burning theatre. I only wish you had told me. That is to say, it is never fair to keep your counsel in the dark." "You mean you wish I had not lied." She caught him up with swift intuition. "Well, to day I would not, but then—well, I was full of pettiness, it seems to me now. But although I am far even yet from being a fine woman, I know that, I am not a poor enough creature to let you die for me. Oh, you are far too good for me. I never dreamed that a man would go as far as that for a woman in these days. I thought it was only in books." "The veriest trash is inspired by the actual occurrences of life, which is pretty much the same in books as out. And I guess men haven't changed much since the world began, so far as making fools of themselves about a woman is concerned." As she stood with one hand pressed hard against the table, she was far more deeply moved than a few minutes since by fear, although outwardly calm. She had climbed far out of her old self within these prison walls, but she saw steeper heights before her, and she welcomed them. "Then," she said deliberately, "I must cure you. Before I went out, I had prepared that glass of lemonade and put poison in it. I had planned for several weeks to kill him, when a favourable opportunity arrived. I had stolen a secret poison from Anna, out of that chimney cupboard Cassie described. You see that I am a potential murderer, and a cold-blooded one, even if by a curious irony of fate someone else committed the deed. Now do you think I am worth giving up your life for, going to the electric chair? Suppose we postpone further argument until the necessity arises, if it ever does. I fully expect you to be triumphantly acquitted. Tell me," he looked at her curiously, for he divined something of her inner revolutions and hated himself the more that he was interested only as every good lawyer must be in human nature, "could you do that in cold blood again?" "No, not that way, never. I might let a pistol go off under the same provocation. That is bad enough." "Oh no, remove the restraints of a lifetime. Or perhaps it is merely a matter of vibration and striking the right key." "And do you mean that you still want to marry me?" "Yes," he answered steadily. "Certainly I do." Ah! Once more she wondered if he still loved her. But she had been too sure of him and of herself to harbour doubt for more than a passing moment. She had come to the conclusion that he had merely taken her at her word, and she knew the specialising instinct of the busy American. She had, indeed, wondered if it were not the strongest instinct he possessed. And in spite of her new humility, she had suffered no loss of confidence in herself as a woman. She vaguely felt that she had lost something of this man's esteem, but trusted to time and her own charm to dim the impression. For she had made up her mind to marry him. Not only would it be the wisest possible move after acquittal, a decent time after, but during sleepless hours she had come to the conclusion that she loved this brilliant knightly young man as deeply as it was in her power to love anyone. And after this terrible experience, and the many changes it had wrought within her, she wanted to be happy. He had taken up his hat. She crossed the room swiftly and laid her hand on his arm. "I could not stand one word of love-making in jail," she said, smiling up at him graciously, although her eyes were serious. "But it is only fair to tell you now that if I am acquitted I will marry you." And stabbed with a pang of bitter regret that he felt not the least impulse to scout her authority and seize her in his arms, he bent over her hand and kissed it with cold lips, but with an air of complete gallantry. "Thank you," he said, and went out. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 34. Rush slept until 2 o'clock the next day, after a night passed at the Paradise City Hotel in consultation with two of his future partners. They had spent Saturday in the courtroom at Dobton. He had also discovered that the jury enjoyed themselves in the Winter Garden after dinner, and by no means in close formation. Although nominally under guard, it would have been a simple matter to pass a note to any one of them. Two, he further discovered, had been allowed to telephone, and to enter the booth alone. He had been told nothing further of the intention of Cummack and the other friends of his client to fix the jury, had indeed discouraged such confidences promptly, but he saw that if the enemy desired to employ the methods of corruption they need be no more intricate than those of the men that had so much more to lose if detected. The night had been devoted to discussion of the case. He even enjoyed a friendly hour with the district attorney, who notably relaxed on Saturdays after 5 o'clock, and when Rush awoke on the following afternoon he immediately resolved to dismiss the whole affair from his own mind until Monday morning. He would go into the woods and think his own thoughts. They would be dreary thoughts and imbued no doubt with cynicism, himself the target, and they had passed that problematical stage in which the mind, no matter how harrowed, sips lingeringly at the varied banquet of the ego. In fact, Rush's personal problems were almost invariably settled in his subconsciousness, and rose automatically to confront the reasoning faculties without an instant's warning. He was too impatient for self-analysis, and he was the sum of his acts and of the clear mental processes of his conscious life. The bright winter sun struck down through the close tree–tops and upon the brilliant surfaces of a recent fall of snow. The ground was hard and white. The branches of the trees were heavy laden. Not a sound broke the winter stillness but his footsteps on the winter snow. He had put on a heavy white sweater and cap, and he intended to walk for hours, and his nervous hands were in his pockets. He believed he should have the woods to himself, for in winter it was the country club and the road–houses that were patronized on Sundays, and the trolley–car which passed the wood on the line about a quarter of a mile away had, save for himself, been empty. His face remained grim and set until he was deep in the woods, and then it relaxed to a wave of fury and disgust, finally settled into an expression of profound despair. He was but 32, and the prizes of life were for such as he, and a week later he would either be in Sing Sing or bound without hope to a woman for whom his brief sentimentalized passion was dust. It was not execution he feared, for any clever lawyer could persuade a jury into a certain degree of leniency, but long years in prison for the sake of a dead ideal. In spite of his hard common sense and severely practical life, he would almost have welcomed the exaltation of soul which must accompany a great sacrifice impelled by perfect love. But to turn one's back on life for ever, and walk deliberately into a dungeon, change one's name for a number, and become a thing for the sake of barren honour, to drag out his years with a dead soul, to despise himself for a fool, too old and too tired to console himself with a memory of a duty well done. He felt such a sudden disgust for life and for that ill–regulated product, human nature, that he struck a heavy blow at a tree, and brought a shower of snow about his head. If he could have continued to love the woman, and accept the grim and bitter fate with joy in his soul! And if only that were the worst! If he could turn his back on life, with no regret save for its lost opportunities for power and fame! He paused in his rapid irregular walk, and pushed his cap up from his ear. He half swung on his heel, then, his face settling into its familiar lines, he walked slowly toward a faint crackling that had arrested his attention. He came presently upon the glade Alys Crumley had painted in its summer mood. The little picture hung facing his bed. The scene was white to–day. All the lovely shades of green and gold had been rubbed out and replaced with the bright sparkle of snow, and the brook was frozen. But although Rush loved the winter woods, and responded to their white appeal as keenly as to their yearly renewal of verdant youth and gorgeous maturity, they left him quite unmoved at this moment. Alys Crumley, as he had half expected, stood in the little dell. Her face was more like old ivory than ever against the dazzling whiteness of the snow, and under her low fur turban. It looked both pinched and nervous, but she kept her hands in her muff. Nor did Rush remove his from his pockets, although his determination not to betray himself was subconscious. At the moment his mind, conquering a tendency to race, informed itself merely that even in heavy winter clothes, with but a deep pink rose in her stole for colour, she managed to look dainty and alluring. It recalled visions of her on summer nights clad in the soft transparencies of lawn, with ribbons somewhere that always brought out the strange olive tints of her eyes and hair. "I followed you," she said. "Did you?" "When I saw you pass the trolley, I guessed. The Gifnings had invited me to go out to the club with them. I asked them to put me down at a path near here." He made no reply, but continued to stare at her, recalling other pictures, in the studio, in the green living–room, marvelling at her endless variety, and not only of effect. Yet she was always the same, surcharged with the magnetism of youth and young womanhood. I that is, I made up my mind I must have a talk with you about certain things. You said you might go out to the club to day for an hour or two of hand ball, and I had hoped to induce you to come home with me for supper. But Jack Battle told me that you had telephoned off, and when I saw you in the trolley and caught a glimpse of your face, I guessed." "Yes? You make it rather hard." "What does it all matter? You are here, and I am glad that you are." "Are you? But you intended to avoid me to day." "I never intended to see you alone again if I could help it." "I guessed that, too. I met Polly Cummack this morning, and she told me she spent last evening at the jail, and Mrs. Balfame confided to her that she had definitely promised to marry you, that you had proposed to her on the day of her arrest, and although you had faithfully obeyed her orders and not alluded to the subject since, she had thought it only kind to put you out of suspense yesterday. She naively added that the subject had not interested her when you first brought it up, but that you had been so wonderful and devoted since. She means to settle quietly in New York instead of travelling, so that she can be quite near you, and she will marry you as soon as the case has been forgotten by the public. Of course, Polly could not keep anything so interesting, and no doubt it is all over town by now." Alys spoke steadily, with a faint ironic inflection, and she held her head very high. But her face grew more pinched, and the delicate pink of her lips faded. "Yes?" He had turned as white as chalk, but there was neither dismay nor sarcasm in the hard stare of his eyes. His lips were folded so closely that the word barely escaped. "I am going to say everything I have to say, if you never speak to me again. I feel as if I were standing on the point of a high rock and every side led sheer down into an abyss. It doesn't matter in the least down which side I fall. There is a certain satisfaction in that. But you shall listen." "There is nothing you cannot say to me." "And you'll not run away?" "Oh, no, I'll not run away. I shall never see you again if I can help it, but now that you are here I shall look at you and listen to the sound of your voice. And to what I have to say. You hate Mrs. Balfame. You are bored to death with her. You are appalled. You have found her out for what she is. You are going to marry her out of pity, and because you are too honourable to desert a woman who will always be under a cloud, even if you had it in you to break your word, and because you have a twisted romantic notion about being true to an old if mistaken ideal, one of a set that has flourished like hardy old-fashioned annuals under the dry soil of hustle and ambition and devotion to your profession. You had fallen in love, or thought you had, which amounts to the same thing, for the moment, after so many years of dry spiritual celibacy, and it had been a wonderful revelation, and an inner revolution that made you immensely interested in yourself for the first time. You were exalted. You lived for several months at a pitch above the normal, automatically registering other impressions but only half cognizant of them. And now you feel that the love born in delusion and slain by truth you owe the greatest sacrifice a man can make. You feel that to the love born in delusion and slain by truth you owe the greatest sacrifice a man can make." He had stared at the ground during the first part of her speech, and then raised his eyes sharply, his glance changing to amazement and a flush mounting to his hair. "Oh!" he exclaimed, but he would make no other answer, and once more he dropped his glance to the snow. "Are you going to marry her?" "If she is acquitted." "And if not?" Her voice broke out of its even register. He made an abrupt movement, and she cried out: "I know! I know! Polly told me. Sam tells her everything. He suspects you. He knows that Broderick does. But you don't intend to wait for his denunciation. Mrs. Balfame told that to Polly, too. You intend to say you did it. She said she wouldn't let you. Oh, wouldn't she? But you had told her that you would make up a plausible story and stick to it. And I know that you can't prove an alibi. Tell me," she came closer and her voice was almost threatening, Do you really intend to take that crime on your shoulders if she is convicted?" "Yes." "Oh, oh, men will be sentimental fools until, so long as they are born of fools and women. We are made all wrong." She threw her muff on the ground and beat her hands together. Her eyes were blazing. There was a curious red glow in their olive depths. "Well, listen to me. You are not going to do this thing, although I really believe you'd like to do it as a sort of penance. She could not prevent such a monstrous sacrifice if she would, but I can. Just bear that in mind. If you come forward with any such sane proposition, I will make a fool of you before all the world. If Mrs. Balfame is acquitted, well and good, but if she is not, then I'll betray a confidence and run the risk of killing someone myself. But I'll get the truth. Just remember that, and keep off the witness stand." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I know where to get the truth." "You mean that Dr. Anna thinks Mrs. Balfame did it? That Mrs. Balfame confessed to her, and that you can make the poor woman betray her friend while she is still too weak to resist? Well, you are all wrong. I know that Mrs. Balfame did not kill Balfame. If you want the reason for my knowledge, and I know I can trust you, Mrs. Balfame was out that night, and she did take a revolver and fire it. I found it in the house on the night following her arrest. It was a .38. There was one bullet missing. It was found in the tree. Balfame was killed by a .41. She did not go out to shoot Balfame, but because she thought she saw a burglar in the grove. Her revolver went off accidentally, and she is the best shot out at the club. But you will readily understand my reasons for suppressing these facts." Alys had turned her profile and was staring at a tree whose limbs creaked now and again with the weight of snow, sending down a powdery shower. Her thick short lashes were almost together before a gleaming line of olive. "Oh, who was her confederate?" "She hasn't the least idea as to the identity of the person beside her. It was dark, and she was too much excited. Naturally she would be very glad to know." "Well, suppose we dismiss that part of it. We should never get anywhere. Only don't take the stand and make a dramatic confession." "Dramatic?" Once more the red tied nose. His blue eyes snapped. "Melodramatic would perhaps be the better word. Sarah and I are hot on the trail of the right word. But tell me honestly, shouldn't you feel rather a fool? It is such a very theatric, stagey thing to do." "Oh!" He wheeled about and kicked a fallen log. "Do you suppose I have given a thought to that aspect of it?" "No, more is the pity. But as you have a good sense of humour, I rather wonder at it. However, these are not the only things I followed you into the woods to say." "You had it in your mind, then, to find out if what Mrs. Balfame told Mrs. Cummack was true, that I purposed to free her one way or another?" "Yes. I merely waited for the lead. I told you in the beginning that I did not care what I might confess to, or how angry I made you. What does it matter?" "You cannot make me angry, although there are some things I cannot discuss with you." "Of course not. Let us ignore possible sacrifice number 2, and assume that Mrs. Balfame is acquitted, which no doubt will be the case. Few are worrying. And further assume that you will marry her. That she will marry you is the way she put it, not being an artist in words. Once more we will dismiss both subjects, yes?" She was stooping to recover her muff, and he noticed that her hands were shaking and that the dusky pink was in her cheeks for the first time. "I am only too ready, but there is little else for us to talk about." "Yes, there is. When people are on their deathbeds they can afford to be truthful, and you have dug your grave and mine." She was erect once more, and she looked at him steadily, although her breath was short and her cheeks blazing. "What do you mean by that?" His eyes no longer looked like blue steel. They were flashing, and a curious wave of mobility passed over his face. "I mean that you love me now. I think you always loved me. When we spent so many hours together in perfect companionship, when you found so much in me that responded to so many of your own needs. But for the time being, this was only a surface impression. I was unable to strike down to your soul, because between your outer and inner vision was the delusion. You had cherished some sort of ideal since boyhood, and when for the first time in your busy life you met a woman who seemed to materialize it, you never once had a half hour's conversation with her, you automatically rose to the opportunity to discharge a youthful obligation. Isn't that true?" He would not answer, and she continued: "You passed me over because you had to be rid of the delusion first, bag and baggage. There is only one way to get rid of an old delusion like that, and unconsciously you took it. The pity of it is, in our case, that you compromised yourself so promptly instead of waiting, well, for 10 weeks. I had already asked Mrs. Balfame to get a divorce and marry me." "Oh, that night you walked home with her from Dr. Anna's cottage?" "You saw us? Yes, that was the time." "The first time you had ever talked alone with her. I know that you dined there often, but didn't Dave usually do the talking?" "Yes." "And Mrs. Balfame smiled like Saint Cecilia and attended to your wants?" "Oh! It was like you to think you couldn't go back on even an Elsinore Avenue flirtation. But once more, it is a terrible pity that you did not delay your formal offer for 10 weeks. Then you would have buried the last and the supreme folly of your youth, with a sigh perhaps, but you would have buried it. Isn't that true?" "It is true that something incredibly youthful seems to have persisted in me beyond its proper limits, and then to have died abruptly. God knows I have no youth in me to day." "That may well be, but it need not have been. Youth does not die with the earlier illusions. If all had gone well, you would have been reborn into a saner and more conscious youth. Tell me," her voice trembled, but she moved forward resolutely and laid her muff against his chest. He could feel the working of her hands, and eyes and cheeks betrayed the excitement that pride still suppressed. "Tell me, if you had waited, if you could have decently buried that old illusion and forgotten, and married me, should you have felt very old?" "I should have felt immortal." He caught her hands from her muff and flung them about his neck, and lifted her from the ground and kissed her, as if they both stood on the pinnacle and had but a moment before plunging down to mortal death. When he released her a trifle, his face was illuminated. It no longer looked preternaturally strong, neither did it look as young as she had seen it look in moments of mental relaxation. "Ah," she whispered, "this is the fusing, not when that old illusion died." The deep flush ebbed out of his face, leaving it gray, but he did not relax the hard pressure of his arms. "Of what use," he asked bitterly, "when we have only to day?" "It is something to realize all of oneself, if only for an hour. And you have given me my supreme hour. That was my right, for I went down into such depths as you have no knowledge of. And if I struggled out of them alone, and always in terror of surrender and demoralization at the last moment, I have my claim on your help now, for the future is something I have never dared to face. I guessed before Polly told me. Oh, I guessed. I knew you so well. In dreams perhaps, who knows, our minds may have become one. When I came up out of got past the worst, it seemed to me that I came into an extraordinary understanding of you. I can bear anything now. In a way, you will always be mine. The life of the imagination must have its satisfaction. There are worse things than living alone." She drew down his head, but this time she put her lips to his ear. "Now I am going to tell you a terrible secret," she said. Chapter 35 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. There had been a crowd on the day of Frieda's and young Kraus's testimony, but on Monday morning there was a mob. The road as well as the open space before the courthouse was as solid a mass of automobiles as the police would permit, and within, even the wide staircase was packed with people, many from New York City, waving cards and demanding entrance to the courtroom, or at least the freedom to breathe. The sheriff and his assistant, soon after the doors were opened, succeeded in forming a lane, and dragged the women reporters to the upper landing. They found the young men at their tables, cool, imperturbable, having entered through the library at the back of the courtroom. All doors were closed before 10 o'clock, and the crowd without, save only the few that were fortunate enough to have come early and obtain a vantage point against the glass, gradually dwindled away, to renew the assault after luncheon. It was not only the brilliant winter day that had enticed the curious over from New York, but the rumor that Mrs. Balfame would take the stand. The morning droned along peacefully. Cummack and several others, including Mr. Mott, were recalled and questioned further. Rush made no interruptions whatever. The judge yawned behind his hand. The women reporters whispered to one another that Mrs. Balfame looked lovelier than ever, only different somehow. Even Mr. Broderick looked at her uneasily once or twice and confided to Mr. Wagstaff that he believed she and Rush had something up their sleeves. She no longer looked like a marble effigy of herself, but like a woman who was sure of getting what she wanted, much too sure. Her cheeks were almost pink. That was as close as he could get to the upheavals and revolutions that had taken place in Mrs. Balfame of Elsinore and their causes. Immediately after luncheon Rush showed the jury Defendant's Exhibit A, the suitcase that Mrs. Balfame had packed for her husband after his telephone message from the house of Mr. Cummack. He demonstrated that it must have been packed by a firm hand guided by a clear head, a head as far as possible from the cyclonic condition technically known as brainstorm. When he read from the explicit directions Mrs. Balfame had written for the velvet handbag her generous husband had offered to bring from Albany, the jury craned its neck and puckered its brows. This suitcase had been examined on the night of the crime by police and reporters, the cynical men of the press characterizing it later as a grand piece of bluff. But it looked very convincing in the courtroom, and its innocent appeal was thrown into high relief by the indisputable fact that the murder had been committed at least half an hour later. On the other hand, there was reason to believe that Mrs. Balfame had deliberately planned the shooting, and in that case it was quite natural for her to prepare something in the nature of an alibi, that is, if a woman, and an amateur in crime, could exercise so much foresight. The jury looked at the defendant out of the corner of its eye. Well, she, at least, looked cool enough for anything. Then came the great moment for which the spectators had braved discomfort, indignities, and even hunger. The counsel for the defense asked Mrs. Balfame to take the stand. Everybody in the courtroom, save the judge, the jury, and the cool young reporters, half rose as she walked rapidly behind the jury box, mounted the stand, took the oath, bowed to the court, and arranged herself, with her usual dignified aloofness, in the witness chair. She felt but a slight quiver of the nerves, no apprehension whatever. She knew her story too well to be disconcerted even by the sudden wasp-like assaults of the district attorney, and she was sensible of the moral support of practically all the women in the room. Rush asked her to tell her story in her own way to the jury, and for a time the district attorney permitted her to talk without interruption. Rush had warned her after the interview with the women reporters against delivering herself with too tripping a tongue, and his assistant had spent several hours with her in rehearsal of certain improvements upon a too perfect style. In consequence she told a clear, coherent story in the simplest manner possible, with little dramatic breaks or hesitations now and again, but with nothing stronger than a quaver in her sweet, shallow voice. When she had reached the episode of the filter and explained to the inquisitive district attorney why she had made no mention at the coroner's inquest of the somewhat complicated episode of which it was the pivot, so to speak, she gave the same credible explanation the newspaper women had already offered to the public, and then, quite unexpectedly she related the story of Frieda's attempt to blackmail her, and her indignant refusal to give the creature $1. Mr. Gore shouted in vain. The Judge ordered him to keep quiet, and permitted the defendant to tell the story in her own way. Mrs. Balfame apologized to the jury for relating this incident out of order, and then went on with her quiet, plausible story. Her reason for not running out at once was simplicity itself. She must have been in the kitchen when the shot was fired. She had not made a point of regulating her movements by the clock, as some of the witnesses for the prosecution appeared to have done, so that she was quite unable to give the jury positive information upon the subject of the exact number of minutes she had remained in the kitchen. She had washed and put away the glass, of course. She was a very methodical woman. Then she had gone upstairs, leisurely, and it was not until she was in her bedroom that she became aware of some sort of excitement out in the avenue. Even that conveyed nothing to her, for it was Saturday night. She curled her fastidious lip. But when she heard voices directly under her window, inside the grounds, she threw it open at once and asked what had happened. Then, of course, she ran downstairs and out to her husband. That was all. Even the district attorney was not able to interject a hint of the lemonade story, and so, naturally, she ignored it. "Jemima!" whispered Mr. Broderick to his neighbor, "but she is a wonder. I never heard it better done, and I've seen some of the boss liars on the stand. She looks like an angel on toast, a poor, sweet, patient martyr angel, but I'll bet $5 to a nickel that she was just about 3 degrees too plausible for that jury. If she didn't do it, who did? That's what they'll ask. And who else wanted him out of the way? Have you given any thought to that proposition?" His voice was almost as steady as his keen gray eyes, and he looked straight into the wise and weary orbs of a brilliant but a too inabstinent member of the crack reporter regiment who had been missing for several days. The man raised his sagging shoulders and dropped them listlessly. Then his heavy eyes were invaded by a sudden gleam. "Say," he whispered, "that Rush is a good-looking chap. And I don't like those ice boxes myself, but some men do. It's crossed my mind more than once to day that he's got something on his what's the matter?" "For God's sake, hush!" Broderick's low voice was savage, his face white. "They're always likely to say that about a young lawyer when his client is handsome enough, and their imaginations are excited by a mysterious murder case. He's a friend of mine, and I don't want him to get into trouble. He might not be able to prove an alibi. But I know he didn't do it, because I happen to know that he is in love with another woman. I was in the same trolley with them yesterday when they came back from the woods. There was no mistaking how the land lay." "Oh, just so." The other man's eyes were glittering. He looked more like a hunter glancing down his gun barrel. "I see he is a friend of yours, and you've got his defense pat. Well, I'm not going to bother my poor head until Mrs. B. is acquitted and convicted. Ta-ta!" And he slid gently to the floor, laid his head against the infuriated Broderick's knee, and went to sleep. "I say," whispered Wagstaff, "she almost involved young Kraus, all right. He's never been quite so close to the bull's eye before. The very fact that she didn't trump up a yarn, or Rush wouldn't let her, that she saw him when she opened the door, or that he had turned the handle, is one for her and one on him." The Judge, who had taken a few moments' rest, re entered, and conversation ceased. Conrad and Frieda were called in rebuttal, and encouraged to fix the time of Mrs. Balfame's departure and return as accurately as might be. Frieda asserted that Mrs. Balfame, after closing the outer door, had not remained below stairs for more than 3 minutes, and Conrad declared that her exit must have been made 3 or 4 before Mr. Mott left Miss Lack's. Of course, with quiet scorn, he had not looked at his watch. How could he in the dark? As he did not smoke, he had no matches in his pocket. That closed the day's session. The jury filed out, and no man could read aught in the weather-beaten faces save the conviction that the Paradise City Hotel was a haven's delight after a long day in the box, and they were quite equal to the feat of enjoying the dinner served there, with minds barren of the grim purpose behind this luxurious week. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 36. It was nearly 6 o'clock. The courtroom with its round white ceiling looked like a crypt in the soft glow of the artificial light, and the judge, in his black silk gown, with his handsome patrician face, clean cut but rather soft and flushed with good living, might have been an abbot seated aloft in judgment upon a recalcitrant nun. Mrs. Balfame, in her crape, completed the delusion, if the imaginative spectator glanced no further. The district attorney, who was summing up, looked more like a wasp than ever as he darted back and forth in front of the jury box, shouting and shaking his fists. Occasionally he would hook his fingers in his waistcoat, balance himself on his heels, and with a mere moderation of his rasping tones demonstrate a contemptuous faith in the strength of his case. It is to be admitted that his arguments and expositions, his denunciations and satirical refutations, were quite as convincing as those of the counsel for the defence had been, such being the elasticity of the law and of the legal mind, but although an able and powerful speaker, he lacked the personal charm and magnetism, the almost tragical enthusiasm and conviction, alternating with cold, deliberate logic, that had thrilled all present to the roots of their beings during the long hours of the morning. Rush, whether he lost or won, had made his reputation as one of the greatest pleaders ever heard at the bar of New York State. He had finished at 1:45. Immediately after the opening of the afternoon session, Gore had darted into the breach, speaking with a dramatic rapidity, for 4 hours. He sat down at 6 o'clock, and Mrs. Balfame felt as if turning to stone while the judge, standing, charged the jury and expounded the law covering the 3 degrees of murder: first, second, manslaughter. It was their privilege to convict the prisoner at the bar of any of these, unless convinced of her innocence. He dwelt at length upon the degree called manslaughter, as if the idea had occurred to him that Mrs. Balfame, justly indignant, had run out when she had heard her husband's voice raised in song, and had fired from the grove by way of administering a rebuke to an erring and inconsiderate man. The second bullet had been made much of by Rush as indicating that 2 people, possibly 2 gunmen, had shot at once, but the district attorney held no such theory, and had ignored the bullet found in the tree. It was apparent, however, that the judge had given to this second bullet a certain amount of judicial consideration. The jury filed out, not to their luxurious quarters in the Paradise City Hotel, a mile away, but to a stark and ugly room in the courthouse, where they must remain in acute discomfort until they arrived at a verdict. The judge had his dinner brought to him in a private room adjoining theirs, and even the reporters and spectators snatched a hasty meal at the Dobton hostelry, so sure were they all that the jury would return within the hour. Mrs. Balfame did not take off her hat with its heavy veil, but sat in her quarters at the jail with several of her friends, outwardly calm, but with her mind on the rack, and unable to share the dinner sent over from the inn by Mr. Cummack for herself and her guests. The hours passed, however, and the jury did not return. Once the head of the foreman emerged, and the sheriff, misunderstanding his surly demand for a pitcher of ice water, rushed over for Mrs. Balfame. The judge was summoned, and the reporters, men and women, raced one another up the courthouse stairs. Mrs. Balfame, schooled to the awful ordeal of hearing herself pronounced a murderess in one form or other, but bidden by her friends to augur an acquittal from a mere 3 hours' deliberation, walked in with her usual quiet remoteness and took her seat. She was sent back at once. Rush paced the road in front of the courthouse. He had little hope. He had studied their faces day by day, and believed that several, at least, were persuaded of Mrs. Balfame's guilt. Mrs. Battle, Mrs. Gifning, and Mrs. Cummack sat with Mrs. Balfame, who found the effort to maintain the high equilibrium demanded by her admiring friends as rasping an ordeal to her nerves as waiting for that final summons whose menace grew with every hour the jury wrangled. Finally she took off her hat and suggested that they knit, and the needles clicked through the desultory conversation until, after midnight, they all attempted to sleep. The judge extended himself on a sofa in the private room devoted to his use. He dared not leave the courthouse. He told the district attorney, who told it to the sheriff, who told it to the reporters, that the jury quarreled so persistently and so violently that he found it impossible to sleep, and that the language they used was appalling. Midnight came and passed. The sob sisters, worn out, went home. Miss Sarah Austin and Miss Alice Crumley had not returned to the courthouse after dinner. The sheriff appeared at the entrance of the courtroom and announced that the last trolley would leave for Elsinore and neighboring towns within 5 minutes. Most of the spectators filed sleepily out. A few of Mrs. Balfame's less intimate but equally devoted friends remained in their seats near her empty chair, and shortly after midnight the warden's wife brought them over hot coffee and sandwiches. The reporters, having long since consumed all the chocolate and peanuts on sale below, strolled back and forth between the courthouse and the bar of the Dobton Inn. They were bored and indignant and sought the only consolation available. They returned periodically to the courtroom, growing, as the hours passed, more formal, polite, silent. One lost his way in the jury box and was steered by a court official to the sympathetic haven of his brothers. The room itself, its floor littered with tin foil, peanut shells, and newspapers, its tables and chairs out of place, looked like a Coney Island excursion boat. Finally 2 reporters laid their heads down on a table and went to sleep, but the rest continued to address one another at long intervals, in distant tones, obeying the laws of etiquette, but with a secret and scornful reluctance. Broderick, who was reasonably sober, had wandered in and out many times. Occasionally he walked the road with Rush, and more than once he had endeavored to get Miss Crumley on the telephone. He had even telephoned to the hospital to ascertain if she were there. A week ago only he had accidentally discovered that Dr. Anna had been summoned by Mrs. Balfame shortly after the murder and had passed many hours alone with her, it being the deuce and all to extract any information from that closed corporation of Mrs. Balfame's friends. Broderick had surprised it out of a group at the Elks Club in the course of conversation, and then had set his phenomenal memory to work, with the result that he was convinced Alice Crumley held the key to the whole situation. He had gone to her house and pleaded with her to take him out to the hospital and obtain a statement from the sick woman before it was too late, representing in powerful and picturesque language the awful peril to Rush. "I've reason to know," he had concluded, "that Cummack and 2 or 3 others have their suspicions, and there isn't a question that if the jury brings in a verdict of guilty in any degree, and they're a pig-headed lot, Rush will be arrested at once. These devoted friends of Mrs. Balfame have accumulated enough evidence to begin on. He may have gone to Brooklyn that night, but he was seen to get off the train at Elsinore about a quarter of an hour before the shooting. They've been doing a lot of quiet sleuthing, but if Mrs. Balfame is acquitted they'll let him off. They don't want any more scandal, and they like him anyhow. But I have a hunch she won't be acquitted, and then, innocent or guilty, there'd be no saving him. So for heaven's sake, stir yourself." But Alice had replied, "I have besought my aunt and she will not permit Dr. Anna to be disturbed. She says her only chance for life is a tranquil mind, and that the shock of hearing that Enid Balfame was on trial for murder would kill her, let alone asking her to do her best to send her to the chair. I've done my best, but it seems hopeless." This conversation had taken place on Thursday. Today was Tuesday. They were very reticent at the hospital, but he had reason to believe that Dr. Anna had taken a turn for the worse. Could Alice Crumley be out there, and could she have taken that minx Sarah Austin with her? It would be just like a girl to go back on a good pal like himself and hand a signal triumph over to another girl, who would get out of the game the minute some fellow with money enough offered to marry her. He ground his teeth. He was standing near the doors of the courtroom and staring at the clock whose hands pointed to 1:15. Suddenly he heard his name called from below. He sauntered out and leaned over the balustrade. A weary page was ascending when he caught sight of the star reporter. "Brabant Hospital wants you on the 'phone," he announced with supreme indifference. Broderick leaped down the winding stair and into the booth. It seemed to him that his very ears were quivering as he listened to Alys Crumley's faint, agitated voice. "Come out quickly and bring a stenographer," it said. "And suppose you ask Mr. Rush to come too. Just tell the sheriff to postpone things a bit if the jury should be ready to come in before you return. Hurry, Jim, hurry." End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 37. It was 2:10. The 11 remaining spectators, one of them a woman in evening dress, were sound asleep. The sheriff was pacing up and down with his hands behind his back, his perturbed glance ranging between the clock and the door leading into the jury room. Occasionally he slipped on a bit of the debris and kicked it aside. The reporters slumbered at their tables or stared moodily ahead. One gnawed his pencil, another tore leaves of copy paper into morsels and laboriously built something that looked like a child's house of blocks. Outside it was deathly still. The snow was falling softly. It was too early for a cockcrow. Occasionally someone snored. The footfalls of the sheriff made no noise. Suddenly every reporter present sat up with the scent of blood in his nostrils. Their ears twitched. The fumes blew out of their highly organized brains like mist before a bracing wind. An automobile was dashing down the road, its horn shrieking a series of brief peremptory notes which sounded like "Wait! Wait! Wait!" It came to an abrupt halt before the courthouse door, and almost simultaneously Wagstaff, who had wandered forth once more, ran up the stairs and into the courtroom. "There's something in the wind, boys," he cried, smoothing his hair and steering carefully for his chair. "Rush, Broderick, 3 other men, Sarah Austin and Alys Crumley were in that car. They've all gone straight to the judge. Something big is going to break, as sure as death." The sheriff retired hastily to the region behind the courtroom. The young men adjusted their chairs, arranged their copy paper neatly, and sharpened their pencils. Mrs. Balfame's friends went forward to the door behind the jury box which led to the tunnel. Even the sleepy spectators sat up nervously. 10 minutes passed. Then the sheriff, his face now stolid and important, bustled in and across to the jury room, opened the door and summoned the occupants. In every stage of déshabille they filed sullenly in. The sheriff went through the tunnel for Mrs. Balfame. The judge, without his gown and his hair ruffled, was in his seat when the prisoner entered. She came hurriedly, her great repose broken, her face gray. Rush, who had entered behind the judge, met her and whispered: "You are free, but you will need all your self-control. Don't let them have a story in the morning papers of a breakdown at the last moment." Mrs. Battle, Mrs. Gifning, and Mrs. Cummack, who were far more excited than she, took heart at his words, patted their dishevelled hair, and motioned to their husbands, summoned from the Dobton Inn, to draw closer. Whatever the issue, they felt the need of masculine support, albeit they scowled at the obvious form that masculine needs had taken. Mrs. Balfame had looked dully at Rush as he spoke. Between fatigue and the nervous strain of maintaining the superwoman pitch for the benefit of her friends, her mind was confused. She could only mutter: "I'll try. Is it really all right? You'll be free and forever exonerated in half an hour." Mrs. Balfame sat back in her chair, thinking that half an hour was a long time, a terribly long time. How long did it usually take a jury to pronounce a prisoner not guilty? Sitting before the table in front of her were 2 men whom she vaguely recognized. Behind them was the man she hated most now that her husband was dead.
the reporter Broderick, and beside him were Alys Crumley and Miss Austin. What did it all mean? She drew a sigh. It didn't matter much. She was so tired, so tired. When it was over she would sleep for a week and see no one, not even Dwight Rush. The district attorney was on his feet, his face as black as if in the first stages of a poisonous fever. Neither he nor anyone in the courtroom threw Mrs. Balfame a glance. All eyes were on the judge, who rose and made a short address to the jury. "New evidence has just been brought to the notice of the court," he said. "It is of sufficient importance to warrant an immediate consideration, and the case is therefore reopened for this purpose. It is for you, however, to pass upon its worth. Mr. Rush will take the stand." "May it please your honor," shrieked Mr. Gore, "I protest that this case has already been submitted to the jury, and that it is altogether out of order to reopen it." "That is a matter within the discretion of the court," replied the judge sharply. He had slept but fitfully, and was not in his accustomed mood of remote judicial calm. "Mr. Rush will take the stand and proceed without interruption." Rush ascended to the witness box and was sworn. Mrs. Balfame half rose, dropped back into her chair with another sigh. There could be but one explanation of this strange procedure. Rush had discovered that the jury was hostile and was about to incriminate himself. She could do nothing. She had brought up the subject only yesterday, and he had replied curtly that he had taken the pistol from his safe and hidden it elsewhere, and she was too tired to feel that anything mattered much but the prospect of a week's rest. Later she could exonerate him in one way or another. The newspaper men were as sober and alert as if the hour were 10 in the morning. With their abnormal news sense they anticipated a complete surprise. To do them justice, they were quite indifferent to the possibility of Mrs. Balfame's release. If it were news, big news, that was all that mattered. As Rush took the witness chair, the lines in his pallid face looked as if cut to the bone, but he addressed the jury in strong, clear tones. He told them that 2 days since he had been informed by Miss Alys Crumley that Dr. Anna Steuer had positive knowledge bearing upon the crime for which Mrs. Balfame had been unjustly arrested and thrust into jail, but that they were afraid to tell her of her friend's tragic situation lest it shatter her slender hold on life. She was very ill again after a relapse, although quite conscious, and their only hope was in perfect peace of mind. If she recovered, Mrs. Dissosway, in whom alone she had confided, had felt sure she would give the testimony which must set Mrs. Balfame at liberty if the jury convicted her. On the other hand, Mrs. Dissosway had promised her niece that if the doctors agreed that Dr. Steuer's death was but a matter of hours and there was a real danger of Mrs. Balfame's conviction, she would tell the dying woman the truth and take the consequences. Shortly after the case had gone to the jury, Miss Crumley and Miss Sarah Austin had gone out to the hospital, satisfied that Dr. Anna had but a few hours to live. But it was not until Miss Crumley had persuaded her relative that the delayed verdict of the jury meant conviction for Mrs. Balfame that the superintendent, who was a lifelong friend of Dr. Anna Steuer, had given Miss Crumley permission to send for a stenographer and the witnesses she desired. Miss Crumley had therefore telephoned at once to Mr. Broderick, as she knew he would be sure to be in or near the courtroom, and asked him to bring the witness and a stenographer. They had reached the hospital in 15 minutes. Dr. MacDougal had met them at the door of Dr. Steuer's room and informed them that the news of her friend's predicament had been broken to the patient, after administering stimulants, and that she had consented immediately to make a statement. "It took her some time to make this statement," continued Mr. Rush. "She was very weak, and stimulants had to be given repeatedly, but in due course it was completed, signed, and witnessed by Mr. Broderick and the 2 physicians present. I shall read it to you with the permission of the court." He then read them the ante mortem statement of Dr. Anna Steuer. "I shot David Balfame. I make this statement at once, lest I prove to be unable to add the explanation of my motives, and I herewith sign it. Signed and witnessed." The statement continued. I had known for a long time that my beloved friend's life with this wretch was insupportable, but although I urged her repeatedly to divorce him, and she refused, it never entered my head to kill him nor anyone else. I had spent my life trying to heal, and to give comfort where my patient's sufferings were of the mind as well as of the body. I had carried Balfame through several gastric attacks, caused by his disreputable life, with as much professional enthusiasm as if he had been the best of husbands. To have removed him during one of these would have been a simple matter. But that day out at the Country Club, when he insulted the loveliest and most nearly perfect being on this earth, with the deliberate intent to ruin her position, the little all she had in the world that mattered, something snapped in my head. I almost struck him then and there. And when, during the ride home, Enid for the first time told me the hideous details of her life with that man, all the blood in my body seemed to surge up and through my brain. He deserved death, and only death could free her. But how could this be accomplished? Too proud and too obdurate in her principles for the divorce court, she was also too gentle and good and fastidious, in spite of her remarkable will, to strike him down herself. While waiting for a summons to the Houston farm, I paid several calls, and the last was at the Cummacks, one of the children being ill. As I came downstairs from the nursery, I heard the conversation at the telephone, Balfame's drunken compliment to his wife. He said he would walk home. It was then that the definite impulse came to me, and I acted without an instant's hesitation. I always carried a revolver, for I was forced to take many long and lonely rides in my country practice. I drove straight to the lane behind the Balfame place, left the car, put out the lights, and climbed the back fence. It was very dark, but I had been familiar with the grounds all my life, and I had no difficulty in finding the grove. I waited, moving about restlessly, for I wanted to have it over and go out to the Houston farm. He came after what seemed to be hours of waiting, singing at the top of his voice. Mr. Rush tells me there is talk of 2 pistols having been fired that night, and that a bullet from a .38 caliber pistol entered a tree just to the left of the gate. I heard no one else in the grove. My revolver is a .41 and can be found in the drawer of my desk at home. I fired at Balfame the moment he reached the gate. I vaguely remember seeing another figure almost beside him, but as Balfame fell I ran for the lane and my car. I had no intention of giving myself up. I knew that the crime would be laid to political enemies, who, no doubt, could produce alibis. This proved to be the case, and when I broke down and was carried to the hospital, it was with the assurance of public belief in gunmen as the perpetrators of the crime. That Enid Balfame, that serene and splendid woman, whose life has been a miracle of good taste and high sense of duty, would be accused, never crossed my mind. No, it is impossible for me to say with truth that I repent. I might have, once, but these last 6 months, millions of men in the greatest civilizations of earth are killing one another daily for no reason whatever save that man, who seeks to direct the destinies of the world, is a complete and pitiful failure. Why, pray, should a woman repent having broken one of his laws, and removed one of the most worthless and abominable of his sex, who had made the life of a beloved friend past enduring? Moreover, I have saved hundreds of lives at the risk of my own. I die in peace. This statement is made with full knowledge of impending death and without hope of recovery. This ante mortem statement, concluded Mr. Rush, was taken down in longhand by the stenographer, who sits below, and signed by Anna Steuer, M.D., of Elsinore, Brabant County, State of New York. It was witnessed by Doctors McDougal and Mayers, who accompanied me from the hospital to the court house. Mr. Broderick of the New York News, as I mentioned before, also heard the confession and affixed his signature. He handed the sheets to the jury and stepped down. For a moment there was no sound but the scratching of pencils on the opposite side of the room and the faint rustle of paper in the jury box. Mrs. Balfame had drawn her veil across her face and sat huddled in her chair. The two doctors and Broderick took the stand briefly, the former testifying that Dr. Steuer had been of clear and sound mind when she made and signed her statement. Then the district attorney stood up, and in lifeless tones Dr. Anna had been his family's most cherished friend asked if there was any prospect of the self-confessed criminal being examined further. Rush went over to Mrs. Balfame and pressed his hand hard upon her shoulder. "May it please your honour," he said, "Dr. Anna Steuer expired before we left the hospital." Again there was a furious scratching of pens. Not a reporter glanced at Mrs. Balfame. They had forgotten her existence. The judge asked the jury if they wished to retire once more for deliberation. The foreman faced about. The other 11 shook their heads with decision. The judge dismissed them and congratulated the defendant, who had risen and stood clutching the back of her chair. The reporters raced one another down the stairs to the telegraph offices and telephone booths. It was physically impossible for Mrs. Balfame to faint, or to lose self-control for more than a moment at a time. She drew away from the friends that crowded about her, one or two of the women hysterical. "I shall ask Mr. Rush to take me over to the jail for a few moments," she said in her clear, cold voice. "I must put a few things together, and I wish to have a few words alone with Mr. Rush." She turned to the dazed Mr. Cummack. "Take Polly home," she said peremptorily. "Mr. Rush will drive me over later." "All right, Enid." He tucked Mrs. Cummack under his arm. "Your room's been ready for a week." As Rush was about to follow his client, he turned abruptly and exchanged a long look with Alys Crumley. Both faces were pallid and drawn with fatigue, but their eyes for that swift moment blazed with resentment and despair. Chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Chapter 38. When Rush and Mrs. Balfame reached the jail sitting room, she mechanically removed her heavy hat and veil and sank into a chair. "Is it true that Anna is dead?" Her voice was as toneless as the district attorney's had been. "Yes, and we can only be grateful." "And she did that for me. For me! How strange! How very, very strange!" "It has been done before in the history of the world." Rush, too, was very tired. "But a woman—" "I fancy you were the romance of poor Anna's life. She indulged in no dreams of the usual sort, with her plain face and squat figure. No doubt she had centred all her romantic yearnings and all her maternal cravings on you. She thought you perfect, unequalled." "I? I?" She sprang to her feet and thrust her head forward, her eyes coming to life with resentment and wonder. "What am I that two people like you and Anna Steuer should be ready to die for me? Why, I have never thought of a mortal being but myself. Anna must have been born with a dotage in her brain. She knew me all my life. She saw me organize charities, give to the poor what I could afford, find work for the deserving now and again. And she heard me read absurd compositions before the Friday Club upon the duty of women to society. But she must have known that all were mere details in my scheme of life, and that I was the most selfish creature that ever breathed." Rush shrugged his shoulders, although he was watching her with a quickened interest. "Why try to analyze? The gift to inspire devotion, fascination, is as determinate as the gift to write a poem or compose a symphony. It has existed in some of the worst men and women that have ever lived. You are not that, not by a long sight." "Oh no, I am not one of the worst women that have ever lived. Do you know what I am? How I see myself to night? I am merely a commonplace woman everlastingly anxious to do the right thing. That is the beginning and the end of me, with the exception of a brief aberration, a release under stress of those antisocial instincts that are deep in every mortal and exhibited in every child that ever lived. Oh, I am one of civilization's proudest products, for I never had the slightest difficulty with those inherited impulses before, nor will they ever rise again. I've even improved during my long hours of solitude in this room. But it's all of a piece. I've not changed. We none of us do that. I shall live and die a commonplace woman trying to do the right thing. Oh, let us go now. You must rest. You are very tired." I was, but it has passed. The shock of Anna's statement and death brought me up standing. I shall sail for Europe to-morrow, if there is a boat. It was Anna's constant regret that she could not go to the battlefields and nurse, but she would not leave those that depended upon her here. In some small measure I can take her place. They give a first course in London, I am told, and I am strong, very strong." She paused abruptly and moved forward and took his hand. "Good night and good bye," she said. "I shall sleep here to night, and please understand that you are free." "What do you mean?" Rush's face set like a mask, but the colour mounted. The grip of his hand was merely nervous, and when she withdrew hers, his unconsciously went to his hip and steadied itself. "I mean that so far as lies in my power I shall harm no one again as long as I live. Moreover, I have seen how it was with you for some time, although I would not admit it, for I intended to marry you. Perhaps I should have done so if it had not been for Anna. It took that to lift me quite out of myself and enable me to see myself and all things relating to me in their true proportions for once. It is my moment, if I am ever to have one. You no longer love me, and if you did I should not marry you. I say nothing of the injustice to yourself. I could not take the risk of disillusioning you." She laughed a little nervously. "I fancy I have done that already. But it does not matter. Go and marry some girl near your own age who will be a companion, not an ideal with heart and brain as well as feet of clay." "You are excited," said Rush brusquely, although his heart was hammering, and singing youth poured through his veins. "I shall leave you now. You will say good-bye to me now, and that is the last word. I'll telephone my plans to Cummack in the morning. There is no reason for us to meet again. To me you will always be a very wonderful and beautiful memory, for it is something. Be sure I appreciate just what it does mean to have embodied a romantic illusion, if for only an hour. Now, good-bye once more, and find your real happiness as quickly as you can." She had opened the door. She pushed him gently out into the corridor, closed the door and locked it. Mrs. Balfame was alone with the crushing burden of her soul. End of chapter 38. End of Mrs. Balfame by Gertrude Horn Atherton. Read by Lynn Thompson in the Willamette Valley.